Hello everyone. Tonight I prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The gas station where the fuel was cold as ice from Rusty Joe. I've been running these highways for near 30 years now, and I thought I'd seen it all. Every kind of weather, every kind of road, every kind of strange thing that can happen between dusk and dawn, when you're alone with nothing but your rig and the hum of the engine. But what happened to me on that stretch of Route 89 through Nevada still makes my hand shake when I grip the wheel too tight in the dark. It was deep winter, the kind where the cold bites through your jacket and settles into your bones. I was hauling refrigerated goods from Reno to Salt Lake City, running behind schedule because of a delay at the loading dock. The sun had already dropped below the mountains and the temperature gauge on my dash read -15 degrees. My fuel was running lower than I liked, and I'd been watching the needle creep toward empty for the last 20 miles, praying I'd find a station before I got stranded out in the middle of nowhere. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared suddenly around a bend, bright and fluorescent against the black desert night. A gas station materialized out of the darkness like an answered prayer, sitting all alone with no other buildings in sight. The sign out front read, "Desert Rose Fuel," in letters that flickered and buzzed with that particular hum of old neon. I pulled my rig into the lot, grateful beyond measure, and climbed down from the cab into air so cold it burned my lungs. The station looked old. Maybe from the 50s or 60s, with that vintage architecture that you don't see much anymore. The pumps were ancient, the kind with the rolling numbers behind glass panels, and everything had a layer of dust that suggested not many people stopped here. But the lights were on, and that was all that mattered. I could see a figure moving inside the station through the grimy windows, so I knew someone was working. I grabbed my wallet and headed for the nearest pump. The first thing that struck me as odd was how much colder it felt right next to the pumps. Even in that freezing night, the area around the fuel dispensers was noticeably worse, like standing in front of an open freezer. I chalked it up to the wind coming off the desert and swiped my card. The machine took a moment, then displayed a message in green text that simply said, "Pump approved." I pulled the nozzle from its holster and flipped the lever. That's when I noticed the nozzle itself was covered in frost. Not just cold, but actually frosted over like it had been sitting in a freezer. I could see my breath misting in front of me, but this was something else entirely. The metal was so cold it almost burned to touch even through my gloves. I squeezed the handle and heard the fuel begin to flow. The sound was wrong though. Instead of the normal liquid rush, it was thicker, slower, like pouring syrup in winter. I peered into my fuel tank as the pump worked, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The fuel flowing in wasn't the normal amber color of diesel. It was coming out pale, almost white, with crystals forming on the surface as it splashed into my tank. I could see vapor rising, not from heat, but from extreme cold, like dry ice in water. The fuel was freezing, or close to it, crystallizing as it filled my tank. The rolling numbers on the pump clicked slowly upward, and I watched in growing horror as my fuel tank filled with what looked more like slush than diesel. My instinct was to stop pumping immediately, to pull the nozzle out and get the hell away from there. But I was nearly empty, and the next station was over 60 miles away. If I didn't fuel up now, I'd be stranded out here in the darkness with no heat and no way to call for help. The cell signal out here was non-existent, so I stood there, frozen in more ways than one, watching that impossible fuel flow into my rig while my mind raced through explanations that made no sense. When the tank was full, I hung up the nozzle with shaking hands and hurried toward the station to pay. The door was heavy and creaked on old hinges when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was even colder than outside, cold enough that I could see frost forming on the shelves of motor oil and snacks. Behind the counter stood an older man in a greasy mechanic's uniform, his name tag reading Earl in faded letters. He smiled at me, but there was something wrong with his smile, something that didn't reach his eyes. "Cold night," he said. his voice raspy like he'd been breathing that frozen air for too long. "Diesel, right? Pump 3? I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. He rang me up on an ancient register that dinged when the drawer opened. The total seemed reasonable enough, and I paid in cash, not wanting to linger. "You might want to let that fuel warm up a bit before you head out," he said as he handed me my change. His fingers were blue at the tips. "Runs a little cold this time of year." I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to demand an explanation for what the hell kind of fuel he was selling, but something in his dead eyes and that frozen smile kept me silent. I just nodded, took my change, and backed out of the station. The door chimed as I left, a sound like ice crystals tinkling against glass. I climbed back into my cab and started the engine, my heart pounding against my ribs. The engine turned over, but it sounded wrong. There was a grinding, a sluggishness that shouldn't have been there. I gave it gas and felt the rig lurch forward, but the power wasn't right. It was like driving through mud, every movement labored and heavy. The fuel gauge showed full, but I could feel in the way the engine struggled that something was terribly wrong with what I'd just put in my tank. I made it about 5 miles down the road before the real problem started. The engine began to sputter and knock, and I could see the temperature gauge dropping when it should have been rising. My heater, which had been blowing warm air, suddenly went cold. Ice began forming on the inside of my windshield, spreading in fractal patterns across the glass. I cranked the defroster to maximum, but it did nothing. The cold was coming from inside the engine itself, radiating through the dashboard and into the cab. The engine died completely about 10 miles from that station. Just sputtered, coughed, and went silent. I coasted to the shoulder and sat there in the sudden quiet, watching my breath turn to fog in the cabin. I tried the ignition again and again, but nothing happened. The fuel lines had frozen solid. I was stranded in the middle of the Nevada desert in sub-zero temperatures with a tank full of impossible, frozen fuel. I had emergency supplies in my sleeper, including blankets and a small camping stove, so I knew I wouldn't freeze to death before morning. But the night that followed was one of the longest of my life. I huddled in my sleeping bag, listening to the metal of my truck contract and groan in the cold, and thinking about that gas station and the man behind the counter with his blue fingers and frozen smile. I thought about how the station had appeared so suddenly out of nowhere, and how the lights had seemed to beckon me in like a trap. When dawn finally came, I climbed out to assess the damage. Ice had formed all around my fuel tank and along the underside of my rig, like frozen fingers reaching up from the ground. I tried the engine again in the weak morning light, and this time, after several attempts, it caught. Whatever had been in those fuel lines had thawed enough to flow, and the engine roared to life, though it took another 20 minutes before it would run smoothly. I limped into the next town and straight to a truck stop with a mechanic on duty. I explained what had happened, leaving out the more impossible details, just saying I'd gotten bad fuel. The mechanic drained my tank and showed me what came out. It was diesel, normal diesel, nothing unusual about it at all, but there were ice crystals mixed in. Even though the fuel had been sitting in my tank for hours and the day had warmed up considerably, he'd never seen anything like it. I paid him to flush the entire fuel system and fill me up with fresh diesel from his pumps. While he worked, I went inside and asked the waitress if she knew about a gas station called Desert Rose about 60 miles back on Route 89. She looked at me strangely and said there hadn't been a gas station on that stretch of road in over 20 years. The last one, she said, had burned down back in the 80s and the owner had died in the fire. His name had been Earl. I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I just thanked her, drank my coffee, and waited for my truck to be ready. When the mechanic gave me the all clear, I got back on the road and drove straight through to Salt Lake without stopping. I made my delivery and took a different route back, one that didn't go anywhere near Route 89. But sometimes on cold nights when I'm running low on fuel, I see lights in the distance that look familiar. I see that fluorescent glow against the darkness and that old neon sign flickering in the night. And I keep driving no matter how low my fuel gets because I know what's waiting at that station. I know about the frost-covered pumps and the frozen fuel and the man behind the counter with his blue fingers and dead eyes. I know that some places exist between one reality and another, and that the fuel they sell isn't meant for the living. My rig runs fine now, better than ever actually, but there's a cold spot in the cab that never quite goes away. It sits right where the heater vents blow, a pocket of air that stays chilly even on the hottest summer days. And sometimes when I'm alone on a dark highway, I can smell it, that particular scent of cold metal and old frost. And I remember the gas station where the fuel was cold as ice, the driver who delivered his own body from Freightliner Frank there. There's an unwritten rule among us long-haul drivers that you don't talk about the really strange runs. The ones where time doesn't work right, or where the cargo seems wrong in ways you can't quite explain, or where the delivery address leads you somewhere that shouldn't exist. We all have at least one story like that, tucked away in the back of our minds like a photograph we don't want to look at too closely. But some stories demand to be told, if only to convince yourself that you didn't imagine the whole damn thing. This is mine, and I swear on my life and everything I hold dear that it happened exactly as I'm about to tell you. It started with a dispatch call that came through at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October. I was parked at a rest stop outside of Tulsa, trying to get a few hours of sleep before my next scheduled run, when my phone rang with that particular tone that meant urgent dispatch. I almost didn't answer, but work is work, and I was between contracts at the time, hungry enough for miles that I'd take anything legal and most things that were at least technically legal. The dispatcher's voice was unfamiliar, a woman with a flat, emotionless tone that reminded me of those automated systems that try to sound human, but miss by just enough to be unsettling. She told me there was a priority delivery that needed to leave from a warehouse in Tulsa within the hour, heading to a funeral home in a small town in Arkansas called Ashwood Creek. The cargo was sensitive, she said, time critical, and the pay was triple the normal rate for the distance. She gave me the warehouse address and the delivery details and hung up before I could ask any questions. Triple rate for what sounded like a simple 300-mile run raised some red flags, but I was low on cash and high on bills. I started up my rig and punched the warehouse address into my GPS. The route it plotted took me to an industrial area on the outskirts of Tulsa, the kind of place where warehouses sit dark and anonymous behind chain-link fences. I found the address without trouble, though there was no company name on the building. Just a number painted on the side in faded white letters. The loading dock door was open, spilling yellow light into the darkness. I backed my trailer up and climbed down from the cab. A man in coveralls appeared from inside, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same job 1,000 times. He wheeled out a casket on a dolly, the kind of simple pine box that's used for transports before embalming, and together we secured it in my trailer. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes, and the man said exactly 3 words the entire time. "Sign here, Frank." That stopped me cold. I hadn't given him my name, and it wasn't on my truck anywhere. I stared at him, but he'd already turned away and was heading back into the warehouse. I signed the electronic pad he'd left on the trailer gate and got back in my cab. The paperwork that printed out listed the contents as human remains and gave the funeral home address in Ashwood Creek. Everything seemed legitimate, if impersonal. I pulled out of the warehouse and headed for the highway. The drive started normally enough. I merged onto Interstate 40 heading east, settling into that comfortable rhythm of night driving where the miles blend together and the world narrows to the cone of your headlights and the white lines rushing past. The road was mostly empty at that hour, just the occasional semi or late-night traveler. I had the radio on low, playing some classic country station and the heater running to keep the October chill at bay. About an hour into the drive, I started to feel strange. It began as a tightness in my chest, like my heart was working harder than it needed to. Then came a heaviness in my limbs, a fatigue that felt deeper than normal tiredness. I checked my vitals in the mirror. My face, my eyes looking for signs of a heart attack or stroke, but everything seemed normal. Still, the feeling persisted and grew worse. I felt like I was being compressed, like the air pressure in the cab had changed. I pulled over at a rest stop to walk it off and maybe grab some coffee. As I climbed down from the cab, the feeling intensified. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, and there was a strange disconnection between my thoughts and my movements. Like there was a delay in the signal. I made it to the restroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. I looked pale, drawn, older somehow than I had just hours before. When I got back to my truck, I checked on the cargo even though there was no reason to. The casket sat secured in my trailer, unchanged. But standing there looking at it, I felt a wave of vertigo so strong I had to grab the trailer wall to keep from falling. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw myself lying in that box. My own face pale and still, my own hands folded across my chest. I blinked hard and the vision was gone. Just a pine box sitting in an empty trailer. I got back on the road, telling myself it was exhaustion, that I'd been pushing too hard and needed to take it easier. But the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it evolved into something else, something harder to define. I began to experience moments where I couldn't quite remember where I was or where I was going. I'd look down at the GPS and see the route plotted, but it would take me several seconds to process what it meant. My own hands on the wheel looked unfamiliar, like I was watching someone else drive. The radio started acting strangely. The station I'd been listening to faded out and was replaced by static, and through the static I could hear voices. They were faint at first, indistinct, but as I listened they became clearer. They were talking about me, talking about Frank Miller, truck driver, age 47, found dead in his cab on Interstate 40 outside of Tulsa. They described my truck, my route, my cargo. They talked about me in the past tense like I was already gone. I switched off the radio, my hands shaking, but the voices continued. They were coming from inside the cab now, from the speakers, from the vents, from the very air around me. I could hear a woman crying, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it sounded like my sister. She was talking to someone about funeral arrangements, about how unexpected it had been, about how I'd seemed fine just days ago. That's when I understood. The cargo in my trailer wasn't just human remains, it was me. I was transporting my own body to its final resting place. Somehow, impossibly, I had died, and yet I was still driving, still completing the delivery, caught in some loop or echo of the last thing I'd been meant to do. I slammed on the brakes, bringing the rig to a screaming halt on the shoulder of the highway. I sat there breathing hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces fit. The strange dispatch call at an impossible hour, the man at the warehouse who'd known my name, the way I'd been feeling since I picked up the cargo, the sensation of being compressed, of being less than fully real. I got out and walked back to the trailer again. This time I forced myself to open the casket, to look inside and confirm what I already knew. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the latches. The lid creaked open on old hinges. And I looked down at my own face, my own body, dressed in the clothes I'd been wearing when I'd gone to sleep at that rest stop in Tulsa. My other self, the dead me, looked peaceful, almost relieved. There was a small smile on my lips. I closed the casket and leaned against the trailer, looking up at the stars wheeling overhead. I was dead. I had died. Probably of a heart attack, probably in my sleep at that rest stop. But something in me, some stubborn part that couldn't let go, had taken one last job, had gotten up and driven, even though the body that should have been driving was locked in a box in the back. I was a ghost driving a ghost truck making one final delivery. The question was what to do about it. I could abandon the rig, could walk away and see what happened to a ghost who refused his fate. but even as I thought it, I knew I wouldn't. I'd taken the job and I was going to complete it. That was who I was, who I'd always been. The kind of driver who finished what he started, no matter what. I got back in the cab and continued toward Ashwood Creek. The drive took on a dreamlike quality, the miles passing without my full attention, the world outside the windows becoming increasingly unreal. Other vehicles on the road seemed to pass through me rather than around me. Signs became harder to read, their letters blurring and shifting, but the route remained clear, marked in my mind like a track worn deep by countless crossings. When I finally pulled into Ashwood Creek, dawn was breaking over the horizon. The town was small, sleepy, the kind of place where nothing much happens and people like it that way. The funeral home sat on a quiet street lined with old oak trees, a modest Victorian building painted white with black trim. I backed up to their receiving area and climbed down for the last time. A man in a dark suit came out to meet me. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and understanding. "Frank Miller?" he asked, and I nodded. "We've been expecting you," he said. "You made good time." He helped me unload the casket, and together we wheeled it inside. The funeral home was cool and quiet, filled with flowers and soft organ music playing somewhere in another room. "Your family will be here this afternoon," the man said gently. "Everything's been arranged. You can rest now." And with those words, I felt something inside me let go, some final tether that had been holding me to the world of the living. The funeral home began to fade around me, the colors draining away, the sounds becoming distant. I looked down at my hands and saw them becoming transparent, insubstantial. The last thing I remember is the sense of completion, of a job finished and a duty fulfilled. I had delivered my cargo even though the cargo was me. I had driven those last miles and made that final delivery, because that's what I did. That's who I was. And then finally I let myself go. The road ended and I found whatever comes after. But sometimes, so I've heard from other drivers who run those routes, there's a truck that appears on Interstate 40 in the early morning hours. A ghost rig that drives itself running those same miles over and over. And if you look closely at the driver behind the wheel, you'll see a man who looks like he's asleep or maybe dead, his hands resting on the wheel, his eyes closed. They say he's still making deliveries, still running his routes because some drivers never really stop. They just keep driving forever, caught in the loop of one last job that never quite ends. The cargo of screaming dolls. From Big Mike. I've hauled a lot of strange cargo in my 20 years behind the wheel. Everything from live animals to medical specimens to equipment I wasn't supposed to ask questions about. You learn pretty quick in this business that curiosity doesn't pay the bills, and asking too many questions about what's in your trailer is a good way to find yourself without work. But there are some loads that stick with you no matter how much you try to forget them. And the cargo of screaming dolls is mine. Even now, years later, I can't walk past a toy store without my hands starting to shake. It was mid-December, and I was running a route from a distribution center in Cincinnati to a big box store in Portland, Oregon. The load was supposed to be seasonal merchandise, Christmas toys and decorations, the kind of shipment that's routine during the holidays. The pay was decent and the timeline was reasonable, giving me 5 days to make the cross-country trip. I picked up the trailer on a gray Tuesday afternoon, checked that the seals were intact, and signed the paperwork without giving it much thought. The first 2 days of driving were uneventful. I made good time through Indiana and Illinois, spent a night in a truck stop outside Des Moines, and continued west through Nebraska. The weather was cold but clear, and the roads were mostly empty. I listened to audiobooks and talked to my wife on the phone during breaks. Everything was normal, right up until the second night somewhere in Wyoming. I'd pulled into a rest area to grab a few hours of sleep, one of those bare-bones places with just parking spaces and restrooms. The lot was mostly empty, just my rig and maybe 3 or 4 others scattered around. I climbed into my sleeper, set my alarm, and closed my eyes. That's when I heard it for the first time. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. A child's voice, thin and distant, coming from somewhere behind me, from my trailer. At first I thought it might be another truck's radio bleeding through, or maybe the wind playing tricks. But as I lay there listening, the sound became more distinct. It wasn't music or static. It was crying, the kind of desperate, hiccuping sobs that children make when they're truly frightened. And it was definitely coming from my cargo. I got up and went outside, the cold Wyoming air biting through my jacket. The trailer sat there in the darkness, ordinary and innocent looking, just another anonymous box on wheels. The seals were intact, the doors locked. I pressed my ear against the side panel and listened. At first nothing, then faint but unmistakable, I heard it again, crying. Multiple voices now, not just one but several, overlapping in a chorus of distress that made my skin crawl. My first rational thought was that I was transporting something alive, that maybe the manifest had been wrong or deliberately falsified, that there were actual children locked in that trailer. The thought filled me with horror and sent me scrambling for my phone to call 911. But before I could dial, the crying stopped, suddenly and completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. I stood there for a long time, phone in hand, trying to decide what to do. If I called the police and broke those seals to check and it turned out to be nothing, I'd be in breach of contract and probably lose my commercial license. But if there really were children in there, every second I delayed was unconscionable. I was paralyzed by indecision, sweating despite the cold when the sound started again. But this time it was different. This time it was laughter. High-pitched, mechanical laughter. Like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. It went on, building in intensity. And I realized with a strange mixture of relief and new dread that this wasn't human laughter. It was the sound of toys, of mechanical dolls with pull-string voices all activating at once. The crying I'd heard before must have been the same thing. Pre-recorded doll voices triggered by the movement of the truck or changes in temperature or God knows what. I should have been relieved, should have laughed at myself for nearly calling the cops over a trailer full of Christmas toys. But something about the way those mechanical voices sounded in the dead of night, echoing inside that dark metal box, was deeply unsettling. There was something wrong about the rhythm of it, something almost purposeful in the way the sounds rose and fell. It didn't sound random. It sounded like communication. I got back in my cab but didn't sleep. I sat in the driver's seat listening to those dolls laugh and cry and make their various recorded sounds throughout the night. Sometimes they'd all go silent for an hour or more, and I'd start to relax, and then they'd start up again all at once, like they'd been waiting for me to let my guard down. By the time dawn came, I was exhausted and on edge, my nerves worn down to nothing. I should have refused to continue, should have called the dispatch and told them I was dumping the load. But the practical side of my brain reminded me that I needed this job, that my wife and I had bills piling up, that walking away from a contracted load would destroy my reputation. So I started the engine and got back on the road, telling myself it was just toys, just merchandise, nothing to be afraid of. But as the day wore on, the sounds from the trailer became more frequent and more disturbing. I could hear them even over the engine noise and the road sounds, that chorus of artificial voices. They seemed to respond to the truck's movements, crying out when I hit bumps, laughing when I took curves. And then around midday, they started saying words. Not the simple phrases you'd expect from talking dolls like mama or I love you. These were different. These were wrong. Driver, I heard one whisper, the sound barely audible over the highway noise. Driver, we can see you. Another voice joined in, and then another, until there was a whole choir of them chanting in that mechanical, emotionless tone. We know where you're going. We know what you're carrying. We're awake now. We've been sleeping, but now we're awake. I turned up the radio as loud as it would go, trying to drown out the voices. But they were in my head now, persistent and invasive. I could hear them through every song, every commercial, every moment of static. They talked about me, about my route, about the store where I was supposed to deliver them. They talked about how many of them there were. Hundreds of dolls all packed in boxes, all awake and aware and waiting to be freed. The worst part was that they knew things they shouldn't have been able to know. They talked about my wife by name, described my house, mentioned my dog. They recited my social security number and my mother's maiden name, and the password to my email account. Information they couldn't possibly have. Information that no toy manufacturer would ever have programmed into a child's doll. Yet they knew it all, and they weren't shy about demonstrating their knowledge. I pulled over at a truck stop in Utah, my hands shaking so badly I could barely steer. I needed gas and coffee and a moment to think. As I stood there at the pump, filling my tank, I could see the trailer sitting there, and I could swear it was vibrating slightly, as if something inside was moving around. The voices had gone quiet again, but that was somehow worse. The silence felt expectant, pregnant with the promise of what would come next. In the truck stop restaurant, I tried to eat but couldn't keep anything down. The waitress asked if I was okay, and I nearly told her everything. Nearly begged her to call the police or a priest or anyone who might be able to help. But what would I say? That the dolls in my trailer were possessed? That they were talking to me and threatening me and somehow knew intimate details about my life? I'd sound insane. I'd be locked up or at minimum lose my job and my livelihood. So I got back on the road and kept driving west. The dolls sang to me as I crossed the Rockies. Lullabies in that awful mechanical voice that made me want to drive off the road just to make it stop. They told me stories about other drivers who'd hauled them before, about accidents and disappearances and mysterious deaths. They promised that if I delivered them to their destination, they'd be grateful. They promised they'd remember me, would keep track of me, would visit me in my dreams. By the time I reached Idaho, I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. I kept seeing dolls in the passenger seat, sitting there with their glassy eyes and frozen smiles. I'd blink and they'd be gone, but then I'd see them in the mirrors or standing by the side of the road or pressed against the inside of my windshield. The line between what was real and what wasn't had become dangerously blurred. I made it to Portland on the 5th day, barely. I was running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline, my eyes burning and my mind fractured. The store's receiving dock was busy with holiday shipments, and I had to wait 3 hours for them to unload my trailer. During that wait, the dolls were silent. Completely, utterly silent, as if they were sleeping or biding their time. I sat in my cab and watched through my mirrors as the warehouse workers opened the trailer doors and began unloading boxes. The boxes looked normal. Just regular cardboard shipping boxes with the manufacturer's logos and UPC codes. The workers handled them without comment, loading them onto pallets and wheeling them inside. No one seemed disturbed or concerned. No one heard what I heard or knew what I knew. To them, it was just another shipment of Christmas toys destined to sit on shelves and make some children happy. But I saw one of the boxes fall and split open, and I saw what spilled out. Dolls, dozens of them, porcelain faces and cloth bodies and those horrible glass eyes. They lay there in a heap on the concrete, tangled together in a mass of limbs and heads, and for just a moment I could have sworn I saw them moving, shifting, trying to untangle themselves. One of them turned its head toward my cab and its mouth opened, and I swear I heard it laugh. The workers scooped them back up and took them inside. Within an hour, my trailer was empty and I was free to go. I signed the delivery paperwork and got my confirmation and drove away from that store as fast as legally allowed. I didn't stop until I was 3 states away, and even then, I only stopped because I physically couldn't drive anymore. I checked into a motel and slept for 18 hours straight, and when I woke up, I called dispatch and told them I was taking time off. I've never hauled toys since then. I put it in my contract that I won't transport anything related to children's merchandise, and I've turned down jobs that would otherwise have been perfect because they involved toy shipments. My wife thinks I'm being irrational, and maybe she's right. Maybe the whole thing was exhaustion and stress and too many hours alone on the road. Maybe those dolls were just malfunctioning toys activated by the vibration and temperature changes in the trailer. But I don't think so. I think there was something in those dolls, something aware and malicious and hungry. I think they were vessels for something that should have remained locked away, and somehow they'd been manufactured and packaged and shipped all across the country. I think about all those children who probably received those dolls for Christmas, who took them home and put them in their rooms and slept with them nearby. I think about what those dolls might have whispered to them in the darkness, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone in my truck, I still hear them, faint and far away, as if they're calling across a great distance, those mechanical voices singing their awful lullabies. They remember me, just like they promised they would. They know where I am and where I'm going. And someday I'm afraid I'm going to look in my mirrors and see a box sitting in my trailer. A box I didn't load and don't remember accepting. And I'll know they've come back for me. The road sign that knew my route from Diesel. Dave, if you spend enough time on America's highways, you start to recognize certain patterns in the landscape. The way rest stops appear every 50 miles or so. The rhythm of gas stations and fast food joints. The predictable sequence of mile markers counting down toward whatever city lies ahead. You learn to read the roads to anticipate what's coming based on signs and geography and experience. But what happened to me on Interstate 75 in Georgia taught me that sometimes the roads read you back, and when they do, there's nowhere to hide. I was running a load of auto parts from Detroit to Tampa, a route I'd driven probably 100 times before. I knew every curve, every truck stop, every speed trap between Michigan and Florida. It was late September, and I was making good time. Cruising through the Georgia night with my radio playing classic rock and my cruise control set at exactly 9 miles over the speed limit, that sweet spot where you're moving but unlikely to attract police attention. I'd just crossed into Georgia from Tennessee, and the highway stretched out ahead of me, empty and dark except for the occasional car. The moon was bright enough that I could see the pine forests on either side of the road, thick walls of trees that seemed to go on forever. I was in that zone that long-haul drivers know, where your body's driving but your mind is somewhere else entirely, half asleep but still functional, operating on instinct and muscle memory. That's when I saw the first sign. It was a standard green highway sign with white letters, the kind that announces upcoming exits or cities. But instead of giving a town name and mileage, this one read, Driver David Brennan, next right. My full name listed on a highway sign like it was a town or a landmark. I blinked hard, certain I'd misread it, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked again, the sign was exactly as I'd seen it, my name glowing in the headlights. I didn't take the exit, partly because I knew there was no exit there. That stretch of I-75 ran for miles without any turnoffs, and partly because every instinct I had was screaming at me that this was wrong, that following that sign would lead nowhere good. I drove past it and watched it recede in my mirrors, and I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of tired eyes and late-night driving. But 5 miles later, there was another sign. This one read, David, you missed your turn. Just that, no distance markers, no route numbers, just a message directed specifically at me. My heart rate kicked up and I felt sweat break out across my forehead despite the air conditioning. I checked my GPS, but it showed nothing unusual, just the standard road information. The signs around me now were all normal, advertising gas stations and restaurants and lodging at the next exit. Nothing that shouldn't be there. I grabbed my phone and almost called my dispatcher, but what would I say? That the highway signs were talking to me? That I was seeing personalized messages on government road signs? They'd tell me to pull over and sleep it off, maybe suggest I see a doctor, and they wouldn't be wrong. The rational explanation was that I was experiencing some kind of episode, stress or exhaustion, or maybe a small stroke affecting my perception. But then I saw the third sign, And that's when I knew this was real. This one read, carrying auto parts, load number 4527B, destination Tampa. Load number 4527B was exactly what was written on my manifest, the specific identification number for the cargo in my trailer. That wasn't information that would be in my head to hallucinate. That was something I'd have to actively check the paperwork to remember. And I hadn't looked at those numbers since loading in Detroit. I did pull over then, bringing my rig to a stop on the shoulder and putting on my hazards. I sat there with the engine running, trying to think through what was happening. Someone was tracking me, that much was clear. Someone with access to my route information and my personal details, and the ability to somehow alter or project false images onto highway signs. But who would do that, and more importantly, why? What could they possibly gain from frightening a random truck driver in the middle of the night? I pulled out my phone and called my wife, needing to hear a familiar voice, needing to be anchored to normalcy. She answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep. I started to tell her what was happening, but as I spoke, I realized how insane it all sounded. Signs knowing my name, knowing my cargo. Impossible exits appearing on stretches of highway where nothing existed. She listened patiently and then suggested, as gently as she could, that maybe I should find a place to sleep for the night. She was worried about me. I could hear it in her voice, and I didn't want to worry her more. So I told her I was fine, that she was probably right, that I'd get some rest. We said our goodbyes, and I sat there in the dark, wondering what to do. I could find a truck stop and park for the night, try to sleep this off and convince myself it had all been fatigue. Or I could keep driving and see what happened next. Something stubborn in me, maybe that part of every driver that refuses to let the road beat them, made me choose the latter. I merged back onto the highway and continued south. For a while, everything seemed normal again. Standard road signs appeared at appropriate intervals, giving information about exits and services and distances to upcoming cities. I started to relax, started to believe that whatever had happened was over. Maybe it had been a prank, some hacker or artist with the technical knowledge to project false images, and they'd gotten bored and moved on. Maybe I'd never know what it was or why it had happened. Then, about an hour later, I saw a sign that made my blood run cold. It read, David, 3 miles to accident site. Just that, flat and informative, like a warning about construction or weather. But there was no accident ahead. Or at least there hadn't been when I checked the traffic reports. I slowed down, suddenly afraid of what I might find. My hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. 3 miles later, exactly 3 miles, I came around a curve and saw the flashing lights. Police cars, ambulances, fire trucks, all clustered around a jackknifed semi that had gone off the road and into the median. The trailer had split open, and auto parts were scattered across the highway. Workers in reflective vests were directing traffic around the scene, waving vehicles by slowly. As I passed, I got a good look at the damaged truck. It was the same model as mine. Same color, same company logos, same everything. If I hadn't known better, if I hadn't been sitting in my own cab looking at it, I would have sworn it was my truck lying there destroyed in the median. The driver was being loaded into an ambulance, and I caught a glimpse of his face as I rolled by. He looked like me. Not exactly. Not like a twin, but close enough that we could have been brothers. Same build, same age, same general appearance. I drove on in shock, my mind reeling. The sign had predicted an accident, and there had been an accident involving a truck almost identical to mine carrying similar cargo. The coincidence was impossible, but I'd seen it with my own eyes. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it away. The signs weren't just tracking me. They were predicting my route, predicting what would happen along it, or maybe even causing what would happen. More signs followed as I continued south. Rest stop in 15 miles, David should stop appeared first, followed by David, you need coffee, and then, most disturbing of all, David, don't sleep at the rest stop. Each one specific, each one personal, each one demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't have. and I found myself obeying them despite myself, stopping when they told me to stop, driving when they told me to drive, as if I'd surrendered my free will to these impossible messages. The rest stop I pulled into was nearly empty, just my truck and a couple of cars. I went inside to use the restroom and get coffee, like the signs had suggested. As I stood at the coffee machine, a man approached me. He was wearing a security uniform for the rest stop, though I'd never seen rest stop security before. He looked at me with an expression of profound sadness and said 3 words, "You're still alive." Before I could respond, before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the men's restroom. I followed him, but when I pushed open the door, the restroom was empty. All the stalls were open and vacant, and there was nowhere he could have gone. I stood there looking at my reflection in the grimy mirror, seeing a man who looked haggard and frightened and very much alone. I drove all night, too afraid to sleep despite my exhaustion. The signs continued to appear, guiding me south, giving me information I didn't want and warnings I didn't understand.
Stay in right lane. Saved me from a drunk driver who swerved into the left lane where I'd been about to move.
Exit here for gas directed me to a station just before my fuel ran critically low. David, you're going to make it appeared when I was at my most frightened and confused. By the time I reached Tampa, dawn was breaking and I was running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. I made my delivery without incident, though the warehouse workers commented that I looked terrible and should get some rest. I signed the paperwork and climbed back into my cab, exhausted beyond measure. My return route was already plotted in my GPS, the familiar drive back north toward home. That's when I saw the final sign. It appeared on the GPS screen itself, replacing the route information. Instead of turn-by-turn directions, there was a message. "David, this route is safe. The other route wasn't. You changed your future tonight. Next time, trust the signs immediately." The GPS flickered and returned to normal, showing my route home. But I sat there for a long time thinking about what that message meant. The accident I'd seen, the truck that looked like mine, the driver who looked like me. Had that been my future? Had I been heading toward that crash, toward injury or death, and the signs had been steering me away from it? Had something, some intelligence or force or technology, been trying to save my life? I drove home carefully, paying attention to every road sign I passed, looking for messages that never appeared. The trip back was uneventful, ordinary, exactly as it should be. When I finally pulled into my driveway 3 days later, I sat in my truck for a long time before going inside. My wife came out to greet me, concerned by how long I'd been sitting there, and I held her tight and told her I loved her and that I'd had a strange trip. I never saw another personalized sign after that night. My routes continued normally, without intervention or guidance or mysterious warnings. But I never forgot the experience, and I never dismissed road signs as just ordinary infrastructure again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored them. If I'd taken a different route or stopped at a different place, would I have ended up in that median? My truck destroyed, my life changed or ended. The truth is, I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some things are meant to remain mysteries, and the only thing that matters is that I listened and survived. But every time I see a highway sign now, even just a normal one announcing distances or services, I read it carefully, because I know that somewhere, somehow, the roads are watching, and if they ever need to speak to me again, they know how to reach me. They know my name, they know my route, and they'll make sure I see their message, whether I'm ready for it or not. The rest stop where trucks disappear from Silent Sam. They call me Silent Sam because I don't talk much on the CB radio, don't socialize at truck stops, keep to myself mostly. I've been driving for 32 years, and in that time I've learned that the less you say, the less trouble you find. But there's one story I need to tell, if only to warn other drivers about a place that shouldn't exist. A rest stop on Highway 50 in Nevada where trucks go in but don't always come out. It was late July. The the kind of heat that shimmers off the asphalt in waves and makes you feel like you're driving through water. I was hauling electronics from Sacramento to Denver, running that lonesome stretch they call the loneliest road in America. Highway 50 cuts through Nevada like a scar. Miles and miles of nothing but desert and sky and the occasional town that looks like it gave up on living decades ago. It's the kind of road where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where the silence is so complete it feels like pressure against your eardrums. I'd left Sacramento early that morning, planning to make it to Ely by nightfall. The drive had been uneventful, just me and the road and the endless brown landscape rolling past my windows. My air conditioning was working overtime against the 110-degree heat, and I was going through water bottles like they were going out of style. The sun was starting to sink toward the western horizon when I saw the rest stop appear ahead, marked by a faded blue sign that read "Rest Area, 1 mile." I didn't particularly need to stop, but I'd learned long ago that you take breaks when you can on long hauls, that you don't wait until you're desperate for a bathroom or coffee. So I signaled and pulled off the highway onto the access road that led to the rest area. The road curved through a small rise in the landscape, and the rest stop came into view on the other side. It was larger than I expected, given the remote location. There were maybe 20 parking spaces for trucks arranged in 2 rows, and a separate lot for cars. A low building sat at the center, presumably containing restrooms and vending machines, but what struck me immediately was how many trucks were already there. Every single space in the truck lot was occupied, rigs of all types and sizes parked in neat rows. In all my years driving this route, I'd never seen this rest stop so full. I'd never seen it with more than 2 or 3 trucks at most. I pulled into the car lot instead, finding an empty space near the building. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed something odd. The other trucks were all sitting silent. No idling engines, no lights, no movement at all. Usually at a busy rest stop, you'd see drivers moving around, checking cargo, walking to and from the building. But this place was still as a photograph, all those trucks just sitting there like they'd been abandoned. The heat hit me like a physical force when I stepped away from my air-conditioned cab. It was that dry desert heat that sucks the moisture from your body and makes your skin feel tight. I headed for the building, my boots crunching on gravel that looked like it hadn't been raked or maintained in years. The building itself was in poor condition, paint peeling from the walls, windows grimy with accumulated dust. A sign by the door read "Nevada State Rest Area," but gave no other information. Inside was cooler, but not by much. The building had that abandoned feeling, like a place people had stopped caring about long ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered overhead, casting uneven shadows. There were 2 bathroom doors marked with faded symbols, a row of vending machines against one wall, and a few picnic tables scattered around. But no people. Despite all those trucks outside, there wasn't a single person in the building. I used the restroom, which was surprisingly clean despite the building's general state of disrepair, and bought a bottle of water from one of the vending machines. The machine hummed and clunked, and my bottle dropped into the retrieval bin with a sound that echoed in the empty space. I stood there drinking my water and looking out the window at all those silent trucks, and a feeling of unease began to creep over me. Where were all the drivers? 20 trucks meant 20 drivers, probably more if any were running teams. They couldn't all be sleeping, not at this time of day. And even if they were, you'd expect to see some signs of life, some movement, some indication that those vehicles were occupied. But there was nothing. Just row after row of trucks sitting motionless in the brutal afternoon heat. I walked back outside and made my way to the truck lot, moving between the parked rigs. I looked in windows and knocked on doors, called out hellos that went unanswered. The trucks were all locked, all dark, all empty as far as I could tell. But their fuel tanks were full or near full. Their tires were properly inflated, their cargo seals were intact. These weren't abandoned vehicles. They looked like they'd been parked here minutes ago by drivers who'd simply vanished into thin air. I checked the license plates and registration stickers, trying to get some sense of where these trucks had come from. They were from all over: California and Oregon, Texas and Montana, Florida and Maine. No pattern, no connection, just a random collection of trucks from across the country all gathered here at this forgotten rest stop in the middle of nowhere. Some of the registration stickers were current, others were months or even years out of date, which made no sense at all. No driver would run with expired registration. You'd be pulled over and fined before you made it 100 miles. That's when I noticed the dust. Every single one of these trucks was covered in a thick layer of desert dust, the kind that accumulates over weeks or months of sitting in one place. It coated the windshields and hoods, dulled the paint, collected in the door seams and around the mirrors. These trucks hadn't been here for hours or days. They'd been here for much, much longer, and yet some of them looked recent, newer models that couldn't have been manufactured more than a year or two ago. I pulled out my phone to call the highway patrol to report what I was seeing, but I had no signal. Not even one bar, which was unusual even for this remote area. I walked around the lot trying to find a spot where I could get reception, but my phone remained stubbornly disconnected. I was completely cut off, surrounded by ghost trucks and growing more uncomfortable by the minute. The sun was sinking lower now, and shadows were lengthening across the lot. I decided I needed to leave, needed to get back on the highway and away from this place. I'd file a report with the authorities from the next town, let them come investigate this weirdness. But as I turned to head back to my truck, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. An engine started. One of the trucks in the second row suddenly roared to life, its diesel engine coughing and sputtering before settling into a steady rumble. Lights came on in the cab, bright against the gathering dusk. I watched, frozen, as the truck began to move, backing out of its space with jerky, uncertain movements like whoever was driving wasn't quite sure how to operate it. The truck pulled forward, navigated through the lot, and headed for the exit road that led back to the highway. I ran after it, waving my arms and shouting, but the truck didn't stop. I caught a glimpse through the driver's window as it passed me, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was someone behind the wheel, but they weren't moving. The driver sat rigid and still, staring straight ahead with eyes that didn't blink, hands on the wheel but body completely motionless. The truck drove itself out of the lot and disappeared around the curve in the access road. I stood there breathing hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. That driver had been dead or something very much like dead, and yet the truck had been moving, had been driving itself back to the highway with a corpse behind the wheel. I thought about all the other trucks in the lot, thought about what might be inside them, and felt a wave of terror so intense it nearly drove me to my knees. I ran back to my truck, desperate now to get away from this place. But when I reached my rig, I found that someone or something had been there in my absence. My driver's door was standing open, though I was certain I'd locked it. And sitting in my seat was a figure silhouetted against the light from my cab. They turned to look at me as I approached, and I saw it was a man in a trucker's uniform, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and distant. "Don't stay here after dark," he said, his voice a dry whisper like wind through dead leaves. "If you're still here when the sun sets, your truck will stay forever. You'll become part of the collection, just another rig in the lot, just another driver who couldn't leave." He climbed down from my cab and walked past me without another word, heading toward the building. I watched him go, too shocked to speak, too frightened to move. When he disappeared inside, I finally found my voice and my courage. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and threw it into gear. I didn't check my cargo, didn't do my usual pre-drive inspection, didn't do anything but drive. I peeled out of that parking lot like the devil himself was chasing me, spraying gravel and burning rubber as I accelerated toward the exit. The access road seemed longer than it had on the way in, stretching and curving in ways I didn't remember. The sun was touching the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. I pushed my truck as hard as I dared on that narrow road, terrified that I wouldn't make it to the highway before darkness fell. The steering wheel felt strange under my hands, like it was resisting me, like the truck wanted to turn around and go back to that lot. I finally burst onto Highway 50, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. I merged onto the highway without stopping, without even slowing down, and I didn't let up on the gas until that rest stop was miles behind me. I drove straight through to Eerie without stopping, my hands shaking on the wheel, my mind replaying what I'd seen over and over. In Eerie, I pulled into a truck stop and immediately went inside to find the manager. I told him about the rest stop, about the trucks, about the driver who'd warned me to leave before dark. He listened to my story with a strange expression on his face, something between pity and understanding. When I finished, he sighed and poured me a cup of coffee. "You're not the first driver to come through here with that story," he said quietly. "There have been others over the years, not many, but enough. They all describe the same thing. A rest stop full of trucks with no drivers. A feeling of wrongness, a warning to leave before sunset. Some of them saw trucks driving themselves away. Some saw drivers who looked dead or wrong somehow. All of them got away just in time." He told me that the highway patrol had investigated multiple times but never found anything unusual. When they drove to that location, there was just an abandoned rest area with maybe one or two trucks parked there. Nothing strange or supernatural, but every few months another driver would come through with the same story I'd told. A rest stop that appeared normal until you stopped there. A collection of ghost trucks gathering in the desert. A place where trucks and drivers vanished from the world. "Best thing you can do is forget about it," the manager advised. "Don't go back there, don't try to investigate it, don't report it to anyone who won't believe you. That rest stop is a trap and you were smart enough or lucky enough to escape. A lot of other drivers weren't so fortunate. Their trucks are still sitting in that lot and probably always will be." I took his advice. I finished my run to Denver and drove back to California on a different route, one that didn't take me anywhere near Highway 50. I never reported what I saw to the authorities because what would be the point? They'd investigate and find nothing, just like they always did. And I'd be marked as crazy or unreliable, maybe lose my commercial license over concerns about my mental state. But I've never forgotten that rest stop, and I've never driven Highway 50 through that area again. I tell other drivers to avoid it when I can, though I try to be subtle about it, just suggesting they take a different route without explaining why. Some of them look at me strangely, like they know something I'm not saying, and once in a while, one of them will nod slowly and say they've heard stories about that stretch of road, about places where trucks disappear and drivers are never seen again. I think about those trucks sometimes, sitting in that lot in the desert heat. I wonder how many there are now, whether that driver I saw leaving was the last or whether more have joined the collection since my visit. I wonder if the drivers are still somehow present, trapped in their cabs, watching and waiting for rescue that will never come. And I wonder what happens to the trucks that drive away, those rigs with dead drivers behind their wheels, heading back out onto the highway to destinations unknown. But mostly I'm grateful that I escaped, that I listened to the warning and left before it was too late. I'm grateful that my truck isn't sitting in that lot right now, my body rigid behind the wheel, my eyes staring at nothing while the desert dust slowly buries me and my rig becomes just another ghost in a collection of ghosts. The road is long and lonely enough without becoming part of it forever, without becoming another story that drivers tell each other in hushed voices when they think no one else is listening. So if you're ever driving Highway 50 through Nevada and you see a rest stop with a lot full of trucks, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't even slow down. Because some rest stops offer rest, and some offer something much darker. And the only way to tell the difference is to avoid the ones that feel wrong, the ones that are too full or too empty or too quiet. Trust your instincts, trust the warnings, and whatever you do, don't stay after dark. The highway patrol car, without a driver, from Highway Hanky, have been hauling loads across the American highway system for going on 40 years now. And in that time, I've been pulled over by police more times than I can count. Routine inspections, speeding tickets, weight checks, license verifications. It comes with the territory when you're on the road as much as I am. I've been stopped by every kind of law enforcement you can imagine, from small-town sheriffs to state troopers to DOT officers. But I've never in all those years encountered anything like what happened to me on Interstate 80 in Wyoming on a cold October night. I was running a load of machinery parts from Omaha to Sacramento, making good time through Nebraska and into Wyoming. The weather was clear, the roads were dry, and traffic was light, just the way I like it. It was around 11 at night when I crossed the state line, the kind of dark where your headlights seem to only push back the blackness rather than truly illuminate anything. The landscape on either side of the highway was invisible, just a vast emptiness marked occasionally by distant lights. I had my cruise control set at 67 miles per hour, exactly 2 miles over the speed limit. It's a habit I've developed over decades of driving, fast enough to make good time but slow enough to avoid attracting attention from law enforcement. My CB radio was quiet, no chatter from other drivers, and my music was playing low, some old country station that faded in and out as I moved between broadcast ranges. It was peaceful, meditative, the kind of night driving I'd come to love. That's when I saw the lights in my mirror, red and blue, flashing in that distinctive pattern that every driver recognizes instantly. A highway patrol car, coming up fast behind me, closing the distance with obvious intention. I sighed and started, looking for a safe place to pull over, checking my mirrors and putting on my signal. I wasn't too worried. My papers were in order, my load was legal, and I wasn't speeding enough to warrant more than a warning. This would be a routine stop, maybe 5 minutes on the shoulder, and then I'd be on my way. I pulled onto the shoulder and brought my rig to a complete stop, putting it in park and turning on my hazard lights. The patrol car pulled up behind me, its lights still flashing, illuminating the inside of my cab in alternating red and blue. I rolled down my window and got my license and registration ready, waiting for the officer to approach. The procedure is always the same. They come up to your window, ask for your documents, explain why they stopped you, and either write a ticket or let you go with a warning. But nobody came. I sat there with my window down, cold October air flowing into the cab, my documents in my hand, waiting. A minute passed, then 2, then 5. The patrol car's lights kept flashing, but I couldn't see any movement in my mirrors. Usually officers approach immediately, or they sit in their car for a minute running your information through their computer. But this was taking too long. Something was off. I adjusted my mirror to get a better look at the patrol car. It was a standard Wyoming highway patrol vehicle, a white SUV with the state seal and the proper markings. The light bar on top was still flashing, and I could see that the engine was running based on the exhaust vapor in the cold air. But I couldn't see anyone inside. The cab appeared empty, the driver's seat vacant, no officer visible. My first thought was that the officer had gotten out on the passenger side for some reason, maybe to approach from that direction, though that would be highly unusual and against standard procedure. I opened my door and climbed down from my cab, intending to walk back and see what was going on. Maybe there was an emergency, maybe the officer needed help, maybe there was some situation I wasn't aware of. As I approached the patrol car, I could see more clearly through its windows. The driver's seat was definitely empty. So was the passenger seat. So was the entire vehicle. There was no one inside the patrol car at all. The lights were flashing. The engine was running. The radio was crackling with occasional dispatch communications, but there was no driver. No officer anywhere to be seen. I stopped walking about 10 feet from the patrol car, suddenly uncertain. This was wrong, deeply wrong, in ways my mind was struggling to process. Police cars don't pull people over by themselves. They don't drive themselves, don't operate without officers inside them. Yet here was a patrol car that had clearly been following me, had clearly signaled for me to stop, had clearly pulled over behind me, all apparently without anyone at the wheel. I looked up and down the highway, thinking maybe the officer had gotten out and walked away for some reason, though that made no sense either. The road was empty in both directions, no other vehicles visible, no pedestrians, no lights except for my truck and this patrol car. The darkness beyond the shoulder was complete, and the silence was broken only by the idle of both engines and the occasional crackle of the patrol car's radio. I approached the driver's side door carefully, my heart pounding now, adrenaline making my hands shake. The door was locked, but through the window I could see the interior clearly. The computer mounted on the console was on, displaying what looked like a standard patrol interface. The radio was functional, crackling with dispatches about other units in other locations. There were coffee cups in the holders, paperwork clipped to a board on the seat, a jacket hanging in the back. All the normal accoutrements of an active patrol vehicle, but no officer. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The computer screen was displaying information, text scrolling across in white letters on a black background. And it was about me. My name, my license number, my truck's registration, my cargo details, my route from Omaha to Sacramento. Complete information that the officer would have pulled up after stopping me. But there was no officer. The computer was displaying data as if someone had requested it, as if someone was sitting right there reading it. But the seat was empty. I backed away from the patrol car, my mind racing to find an explanation. Maybe this was some kind of new remote-controlled vehicle, operated from a distance by an officer who was monitoring from elsewhere. But that didn't explain how it had followed me, how it had timed its lights to pull me over, how it was continuing to idle behind my truck like a real stop in progress, and if it was remotely controlled, why? What would be the point? The radio in the patrol car suddenly came to life with a voice that wasn't a dispatcher. It was mechanical, synthesized, like a computer-generated voice, but with odd inflections that made it sound almost alive. Driver Henry Thompson, it said, using my full name. You have been stopped for a routine inspection. Please return to your vehicle and wait for further instructions. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over my own feet. The voice wasn't coming from a human. It wasn't even a recording of a human. It was something else, something that knew my name and knew I was standing there listening. I turned and ran back to my truck, climbing into the cab and slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I tried to decide what to do. Drive away? Call for help? Wait for whatever was supposed to happen next? The patrol car's lights suddenly went dark. The flashing red and blue stopped, and the vehicle's headlights turned off. For a moment, I thought it had shut down completely, that whatever strange malfunction or phenomenon had caused this was ending. But then the patrol car's engine revved and it began to move. It pulled around my truck slowly, deliberately, its dark windows reflecting nothing. It moved into the lane ahead of me and stopped, blocking my path forward. Then it just sat there, dark and silent, a barrier between me and the rest of the highway. I couldn't go forward without driving around it, and something told me that would be a very bad idea. I grabbed my CB radio and called for any drivers in the area. This is Highway Hank on Interstate 80, mile marker 132 westbound. I've got a situation here with a highway patrol car. Anyone in the area, please respond. Static answered me, loud and persistent. I tried again, changing channels, but every channel was the same. Just static, as if every radio frequency had suddenly been jammed. My cell phone was next. I tried to call 911, but the call wouldn't connect. No signal, the display said, even though I'd had full bars just minutes before. I tried my dispatcher, my wife, anyone I could think of, but nothing worked. I was completely cut off, alone on this stretch of highway with a patrol car that apparently operated without a driver and seemed determined to keep me from leaving. Time passed strangely after that. I watched the clock on my dashboard, but the minutes seemed to move at irregular speeds, sometimes racing forward and sometimes crawling. The patrol car remained where it was, blocking my path, occasionally revving its engine as if reminding me it was still active. I didn't dare try to drive around it or back up and turn around. Something about the situation felt like a test, like I was being evaluated for how I would respond. Then, at what my clock said was 2:15 in the morning, though I had no sense of that much time having passed, the patrol car's lights came on again. Not the emergency lights this time, just the regular headlights and running lights. The vehicle began to move again, pulling back onto the highway and accelerating away. It drove west, following the road, and within seconds it had disappeared into the darkness ahead. I sat there for another 10 minutes, afraid to move, afraid this was some kind of trick. But eventually I had to make a choice. I couldn't sit on the shoulder forever. I started my engine, checked my mirrors, and pulled back onto the highway. I drove slowly at first, expecting the patrol car to reappear or something else strange to happen. But the road ahead was clear and empty. I made it to the next town, a small place called Rollins, and pulled into the first truck stop I found. Inside, I asked the clerk if there had been any reports of unusual highway patrol activity in the area. She looked at me strangely and said no. Everything had been quiet all night. I asked if she'd heard about any problems with patrol cars, maybe some kind of equipment malfunction or stolen vehicle. Again, she said no and asked if I was okay. I didn't tell her what had happened. I just bought some coffee and went back to my truck. I called my dispatcher and told him I was taking an extended break, that I needed to rest before continuing. He was fine with that, said I'd been making good time anyway and had hours to spare. I slept in my cab for the rest of the night, or tried to, though every time I closed my eyes I saw that empty patrol car sitting in my mirrors. When dawn came, I continued my journey to Sacramento. The rest of the trip was uneventful. No more strange patrol cars, no more mysterious stops. I delivered my load on time and took a different route back east, one that didn't go through Wyoming. I told myself I'd just avoid that stretch of I-80 in the future, that it was an isolated incident that wouldn't repeat. But I've talked to other drivers since then, and I've heard similar stories. Patrol cars that appear out of nowhere and pull drivers over but have no officers inside. Vehicles that seem to operate on their own. Following trucks, blocking roads, disappearing into the night. Most drivers don't report it because it sounds insane. A few, like me, mention it quietly in truck stops and on CB radio when they think someone might believe them. I've developed theories about what I encountered that night. Maybe it was some kind of experimental autonomous vehicle program being tested by law enforcement. Maybe it was a prank or a psychological experiment. Maybe it was something paranormal. A ghost patrol car operated by the spirit of an officer who died on that stretch of highway. Or maybe, and this is the theory that frightens me most, it was something else entirely. Something that uses our infrastructure and our technology to interact with us for purposes we can't understand. Whatever it was, I'm grateful it let me go. I'm grateful I didn't try to run or fight or do anything that might have escalated the situation. I followed its instructions, waited when it told me to wait, and stayed calm even when every instinct was screaming at me to panic. And when it finally released me, I drove away and didn't look back. But I think about that night often, especially when I'm driving through dark stretches of highway in the middle of nowhere. I think about how vulnerable we are out here, how isolated, how dependent on systems and structures we don't fully understand. And I watch my mirrors more carefully now, paying attention to every vehicle that comes up behind me, looking for patrol cars that might not have drivers, for lights that might signal something other than ordinary law enforcement. Because I know now that the highway holds more than just asphalt and steel and the trucks and cars that travel its length. It holds mysteries, anomalies, things that operate in the spaces between normal and impossible. And sometimes those things pull you over and make you wait while they decide what to do with you. And all you can do is sit there in your cab and hope that when they're done, they'll let you drive away to tell the story to anyone who'll listen. The town with roads that rearrange themselves from mudflap. Mike, every driver has a town they dread passing through. A place where the roads are confusing, or the traffic is nightmarish, or the local police are particularly strict about speed limits. For most of my career, I never had a problem with any particular town. I learned the routes, memorized the tricky intersections, adapted to local conditions. But that all changed when I first drove through a place called Milford, a small town in central Pennsylvania that I swear exists on some maps and not on others. A town where the roads don't follow the normal rules of geography and navigation. I was hauling a load of furniture from North Carolina to New York City, a route I'd driven dozens of times before. My usual path took me up Interstate 95, but there was a major accident near Baltimore that had the highway shut down for hours. My dispatcher rerouted me to take US Route 15 north through Pennsylvania instead. A longer route, but one that would at least keep me moving. I'd never driven that particular road before, but I figured it would be straightforward enough. Just follow the GPS and make decent time. The drive through Pennsylvania was pleasant at first. Rolling hills and farmland. Small towns that appeared every 20 or 30 miles. It was late afternoon when my GPS instructed me to take a detour for road construction, directing me off Route 15 and onto a series of smaller state roads. This happened sometimes and I didn't think much of it. The roads got narrower and the towns got smaller, but I was still making progress in roughly the right direction. That's when I entered Milford. There was a green sign at the town limits that read, "Welcome to Milford. Pennsylvania, population 3,847, founded 1823. The town looked typical for the region, old houses and brick buildings, a main street with shops and a post office, churches with tall steeples, and residential streets branching off in various directions. My GPS showed me a simple route through town, basically straight through on Main Street, and then back out to a state road on the other side. I drove down Main Street following the GPS directions, but when I reached the end of the business district, the road my GPS told me to take wasn't there. Instead, there were 3 different streets branching off, none of them matching what my GPS showed. I stopped at the intersection, confused, and watched as my GPS tried to recalculate. The map on the screen flickered and jumped, showing different street layouts each time it refreshed. One moment it showed the road I needed on the left, the next moment on the right, and then straight ahead. I chose the middle road, figuring it would eventually lead me in the right general direction. But after 2 blocks, that road ended in a cul-de-sac surrounded by houses. I backed up my truck, turned around, and made my way back to the main intersection. This time I tried the left option. That road curved around and after several turns brought me right back to Main Street, back where I'd started from. It was as if the town's roads were arranged in a loop with no actual way out. I parked my truck and got out to look for someone who could give me directions. It was around 5 in the evening, and the streets should have been busy with people coming home from work or running errands. But Milford was strangely quiet. I could see lights on in houses and businesses, could hear the faint sound of a television through an open window, but I didn't see a single person. No cars driving by, no pedestrians on the sidewalks, no one at all. I walked into a gas station on the corner, and a bell chimed above the door as I entered. The store was well lit and appeared normal. Shelves stocked with snacks and drinks, a counter with a register, but no attendant. I called out a hello and waited, but nobody responded. Behind the counter, a coffee pot sat on a burner, still hot. and a half-eaten sandwich sat on a plate next to the register, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. I left the gas station and tried the post office next door. Same situation, lights on, doors unlocked, but completely empty of people. The clock on the wall showed 5:15, which matched my watch, and there were packages and mail sorted into bins. Work clearly interrupted mid-task. I was starting to feel deeply unsettled. Where was everyone? Had there been some kind of evacuation that I hadn't been warned about? I got back in my truck and tried my cell phone to call my dispatcher, but I had no signal. The phone showed full bars but couldn't connect to any calls or data. My CB radio was similarly useless, just static on every channel. I was cut off from the outside world, trapped in a town that seemed to be playing tricks on me. And I had no way to call for help or even confirm that this was actually happening. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of following my GPS or trying to navigate by instinct, I would systematically explore every street until I found one that led out of town. It was a tedious plan, but it was all I could think of. I started driving through the residential areas, taking notes of which streets I'd tried and which directions they'd taken me. But that's when I discovered the real problem. The streets were changing. I'd drive down a street going north, turn around and come back, and the intersection I just left would have different streets branching from it. Roads appeared and disappeared, turned into dead ends or looped back on themselves, connected in ways that made no geometric sense. I'd passed the same house 3 times, approaching from 3 different directions that should have been impossible given the layout I'd seen. I pulled over on a residential street and got out my old paper map of Pennsylvania, the kind I always carried as a backup to GPS. I found Milford on the map easily enough, a small dot with a single road running through it. According to the map, Main Street should cut straight through town from south to north, a simple route that would take maybe 2 minutes to drive. But that wasn't the reality I was experiencing. This town was much larger than the map indicated, with dozens of streets and neighborhoods that shouldn't exist. As evening turned to dusk and the streetlights came on, I started to panic. I'd been trying to leave this town for over 2 hours, and I was no closer to finding an exit than when I'd started. My fuel gauge was showing 3/4 full, so I wasn't in immediate danger of running out of gas, but I was losing daylight, and my anxiety was mounting. I needed to find a way out before dark, though I couldn't articulate why I felt that was so important. That's when I saw another truck. It was parked on a side street, a semi similar to mine with out-of-state plates. I drove over and parked behind it, relieved to see another driver, someone who might be able to explain what was happening or at least confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. I walked up to the truck and knocked on the driver's door. The window rolled down and a man's face appeared, haggard and exhausted. "You're new here," he said, not a question but a statement. "How long have you been trying to leave?" I told him about 2.5 hours and he laughed bitterly. "I've been here for 3 days. Name's Marcus and welcome to the trap." Marcus climbed down from his truck and we sat on his bumper while he explained. He'd entered Milford 3 days ago during a routing detour, just like me, and hadn't been able to find his way out since. The roads rearranged themselves. The town seemed to have no actual exits, and every attempt to navigate out just led back into the center. He'd tried driving for hours in a straight line, thinking he'd eventually leave the town limits, but somehow he'd always end up back on Main Street. "Where are all the people?" I asked, and Marcus shrugged. "No idea. Haven't seen a single person since I got here. The houses all look occupied, there's fresh food in the stores, but nobody's around. It's like the whole town is automated or something, running on its own without any residents." He pointed to his fuel gauge, which was showing nearly empty. "I'm almost out of gas. The station pumps work, but they don't accept credit cards or cash. They just keep displaying an error message." We decided to work together to pool our knowledge and try to find a systematic way out. Marcus had been taking notes on his experiences, mapping which streets led where, trying to find patterns in how the roads rearranged. His notes were extensive, pages and pages of observations, but no clear pattern had emerged. Some streets stayed consistent, others changed constantly, and there seemed to be no rule governing which was which. As we talked, the sun set completely, and Milford transformed. The streetlights came on, but they cast strange shadows that didn't quite match the objects creating them. The houses lit up from inside, and through the windows I could see movement, shapes that might have been people going about their evening routines. But when we walked up to the windows to look closer, the rooms inside appeared empty. The movement just tricks of light and shadow. We drove together in convoy, Marcus following my truck as we made one more attempt to navigate out. We chose a residential street that seemed to head east, away from the town center, and followed it as it curved and wound through neighborhoods. We passed schools and parks, a small hospital, a shopping plaza, all the infrastructure of a functioning town, all completely empty of people. After an hour of driving, we found ourselves back on Main Street. We'd somehow traveled in a complete circle despite making turns that should have taken us in a straight line away from town. Marcus got on his CB radio and we talked as we drove, comparing notes trying to figure out what to do. His fuel was critically low now and my own was down to half a tank. If we didn't find a way out soon, we'd both be stranded. That's when I noticed something carved into a wooden fence post along one of the residential streets. It was hard to see in the darkness, but my headlights caught it as I drove past. I stopped and backed up to read it. The carving was crude but deliberate. Follow the church bells west at midnight. I called Marcus over and showed him. We checked our watches. It was 11:45. We had 15 minutes to find a church and position ourselves to head west when the bells rang. We drove back toward Main Street and found a church with a tall steeple, a white wooden building that looked well maintained despite the town's emptiness. We parked our trucks facing west on a side street near the church and waited. The minutes ticked by slowly, and I found myself holding my breath as midnight approached. At exactly 12, the church bells began to ring, a slow, solemn tolling that echoed through the empty streets. On the 12th toll, I put my truck in gear and started driving west, with Marcus following close behind. The streets ahead looked normal, residential and quiet, but as we drove, something changed. The houses became less frequent, the street lights more spread out, and then suddenly we passed a sign that read, "Thank you for visiting Milford," and we were out, driving on a dark country road with open fields on either side. We both pulled over immediately, stopping on the shoulder and getting out to make sure it was real. The road behind us stretched back into darkness with no lights visible, no sign of Milford at all. It was as if the town had simply disappeared. We stood there for a long time, breathing the cold night air, relieved beyond measure to be free. Marcus's truck ran out of fuel about 5 miles down the road, and I gave him enough diesel for my reserve tank to make it to the next town. We went through a proper town with actual people in it, filled up our tanks, and sat in a diner comparing our experiences. We'd both been trapped in Milford for hours, both experienced the same impossible street layout, both escaped by following the message carved on that fence post. Marcus had seen the carving before but hadn't understood it. He'd tried leaving at other times during the day and at other hours of the night, but nothing had worked. Only following the bells at exactly midnight had released us. We exchanged contact information and went our separate ways. Marcus sent me a text a few days later saying he'd reported the experience to the state police, but they had no record of any problems in Milford, and when they checked, they said the town was functioning normally with residents going about their business as usual. He'd tried to drive back to investigate in daylight, but when he reached the location where the town should have been, there was just empty farmland and a historical marker noting that a town called Milford had existed there until 1952 when it was abandoned, after an economic collapse. I've looked for Milford on maps since then, and sometimes I can find it and sometimes I can't. It appears on some GPS systems and not on others. And I've heard from other drivers who've had similar experiences, trapped in towns that shouldn't exist, navigating streets that rearrange themselves, finding their way out only through following cryptic clues or waiting for the right moment. It's become something of an urban legend among long-haul drivers. Whispered stories about trap towns that catch unwary travelers. I still drive through Pennsylvania regularly, but I'm much more careful about detours now. I stick to major highways whenever possible, and if I do have to take back roads, I pay close attention to the towns I enter. I look for signs that something is off. Streets that don't quite make sense, an absence of people. That particular feeling of wrongness that I now recognize. And if I see those signs, I don't stop. I drive straight through and hope I make it to the other side. Because I know what it's like to be trapped in a town that won't let you leave. And I have no desire to experience that again. The receiver who spoke in reverse from Rust Belt, Ronan. My line of work, communication, is everything. You talk to dispatchers, warehouse managers, loading dock supervisors, and dozens of other people whose job it is to keep the freight moving. After 30 years of hauling loads across the Midwest, I thought I'd encountered every type of person and every kind of communication quirk imaginable. People who mumbled, people who shouted, people with thick accents I could barely understand. But nothing prepared me for the receiver I met at a warehouse in Detroit. A man who spoke every word in perfect reverse, and who seemed to know things about my future that hadn't happened yet. It was early March, still cold and gray in Michigan, when I picked up a load of automotive parts destined for a small manufacturing facility on the outskirts of Detroit. The pickup had gone smoothly, standard procedure, and I'd made good time on the drive. The delivery address was for a warehouse in an industrial area, one of those neighborhoods where every building looks the same, all concrete and steel and loading docks. I arrived just after 2 in the afternoon, earlier than my scheduled delivery window, but I figured they might be able to take me early. I backed my trailer up to the dock and went inside to find someone who could sign for the delivery. The warehouse was dimly lit and smelled of machine oil and dust. Rows of metal shelving stretched back into shadows stacked with parts and equipment. I could hear machinery running somewhere deeper in the building, a rhythmic clanking that echoed off the high ceiling. There was an office near the entrance with a window that looked out onto the dock area, and through it I could see a man sitting at a desk. I knocked on the office door and entered when he waved me in. He was maybe 60 years old, thin and balding, wearing a pair of thick glasses that magnified his eyes. His nameplate read Dennis Kohler, Receiving Manager. He looked up at me with a pleasant enough expression and opened his mouth to speak. What came out made me take a step backward in confusion. Nun retfa dug, he said. The sounds clear but completely backward, like someone had recorded speech and played it in reverse. But the strange thing was I understood him. Despite the reversed phonetics, despite the impossible backwards flow of the words, my brain somehow parsed what he was saying. Good afternoon. He'd said good afternoon, just in reverse. I stared at him, my mouth hanging open, trying to process what I just heard. Dennis smiled patiently, as if he was used to this reaction, and gestured for me to sit down. Way rough nitiauni bibi, he continued. I've been waiting for you. The words came out backward but somehow made perfect sense in my head, translating themselves automatically into forward speech. I'm sorry, I managed to say. But are you speaking backwards? Dennis nodded slowly, still smiling that patient smile. Say shaulavery tuburo glos nuts rednuoy. Yes, I always have. But don't worry, you should understand. And I did understand, which was almost more disturbing than the backward speech itself. How was my brain doing this? How was I comprehending speech that was literally reversed? Dennis stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out some paperwork. As he moved, I noticed that everything about him seemed slightly off. His movements weren't quite natural, like watching someone in a film that's been played in reverse. all his gestures starting from the end point and working backward to the beginning. He handed me a clipboard with delivery forms, and I noticed his signature at the bottom of the page was written from right to left, the letters themselves somehow reversed but still legible. Arofeb Erenib Evoy, Dennis said, sitting back down and folding his hands on his desk. You've been here before. I shook my head, certain this was my first time at this warehouse, my first delivery to this facility. But Dennis continued, his reversed words flowing with complete confidence.
Tente tonrof woy.
Tub woy liwe motskab. Enore morfiadot. Woy liwe viritedere hatuat nerefid dal. Nagnitamos w nepa. Not yet, not for you, but you will come back. 1 year from today, you will deliver here with a different load and something bad will happen. I felt a chill run down my spine. He was telling me about my future, about a delivery I hadn't made yet, about something bad that would occur. What do you mean? I asked. What's going to happen? Dennis leaned forward, his magnified eyes intense behind those thick glasses. Kurt Roy fokap etni erifa eblu erid. Ogrek etsis waktig nichtemos ni etseksob. Erofib utreoy. Erofib plitegnakwoi. Igamad hakum utsiret. There will be a fire in the back of your truck. The cargo causes it, something in the boxes. Before you're aware, before you can get help, there's too much damage. He was telling me that a year from now I would have a cargo fire. That something I would transport would ignite in my trailer, and I wouldn't notice until significant damage had occurred. The specificity of it, the certainty in his reversed voice made it feel like a prophecy, like a glimpse into a future that was already written. How do you know this? I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Dennis smiled again, but this time there was sadness in it. Strakab kepsaya swasib strakab isayamit. Erotovetsi tapium. Tapetsi erotofium. Teginot fusegab sarot ganinrom. Nasporomot seganinrom fusegab sarot teginot. Emit hegort strakab ganiwami. Dina wairov straurov sitawem rov strakabsi. Because I speak backwards, I see time backwards. The future is my past, the past is my future. Tonight's dreams are of today's morning, and tomorrow's mornings are of today's tonight. I'm moving backwards through time, and what is forwards for you is backwards for me. He was claiming to experience time in reverse, to live his life from future to past, seeing events before they occurred for normal people, and remembering things that hadn't happened yet. I wanted to dismiss it as insanity or some elaborate prank, but the way he spoke, the complete reversal of phonetics that I somehow understood, suggested something genuinely impossible was happening. And his specific prediction about the cargo fire, complete with time frame and details, felt too precise to be random. Can you tell me more? I asked. About what happens with the fire. How can I prevent it? Dennis shook his head slowly, his backwards movements making the gesture seem strange and unnatural. Neverptonekwe. Udarla de nepatisa emrof. Oinise malvet was ike koert esilop etelako. Tropper et daero. Hoiroftis nepatinsate. Tubrofum stierotish. You cannot prevent. It already happened, for me. I saw the flames in your truck, who called the police, who read the report. For you, it hasn't happened yet, but for me, it's history. He was saying that from his perspective, moving backwards through time, my future cargo fire was an event he'd already witnessed. It was in his past, even though it was in my future. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as Dennis processed my delivery paperwork. He told me other things about my future, small details that seemed insignificant at the time. He mentioned I would change the tires on my truck in August, that I would have a minor accident in a parking lot in September, that my wife would surprise me with a birthday party I wasn't expecting. He spoke about these future events as if remembering them, describing them in the past tense even though they hadn't occurred yet. When the paperwork was completed and my cargo had been unloaded, Dennis walked me back to my truck. His backward movements in the daylight were even more noticeable, like watching someone moonwalk through every action. At my truck door, he placed a hand on my shoulder and I felt an odd sensation, like a mild electric shock or a displacement of air pressure. Remember, he said, his reversed voice serious now. Raieno, kabemos liway, nair fiedli nepa. Tap vonk vonwoy, DNA biam tat gani vonk seka meknerefida. Remember, 1 year. You will come back and the fire will happen, but you know now, and maybe that knowing makes a difference. I drove away from that warehouse in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. For the next several weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Dennis and his reversed speech, his claims about experiencing time backwards, his prediction about a cargo fire exactly 1 year from that day. I told my wife about it, and she suggested very gently that maybe I'd misunderstood what the man was saying. That perhaps he had a speech impediment and I'd filled in meanings that weren't really there. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew I'd understood perfectly clear reversed speech, and I knew Dennis had told me specific things about my future. So I started keeping detailed records of everything he'd mentioned. I wrote down the date of the predicted fire, noted his comments about tire changes and parking lot accidents and birthday surprises. And as the months passed, those small predictions started coming true. In August, exactly as Dennis had mentioned, I needed to replace the tires on my truck due to unusual wear patterns. In September, I backed into a pole at a truck stop. Minor damage, but an accident nonetheless, exactly as he'd described. And in October, my wife threw me a surprise party that I genuinely hadn't been expecting, despite normally being good at picking up on her plans. Every detail Dennis had mentioned was occurring exactly as he'd said it would. As March approached, as the 1-year anniversary of my meeting with Dennis drew near, I became increasingly anxious. I checked my schedule obsessively, looking to see if I had any deliveries scheduled for that Detroit warehouse. There were none. I wasn't assigned any loads going to Detroit at all during that time period. I started to hope that perhaps this was the variable that would break the pattern, that by not having a delivery scheduled to that location, I would avoid the predicted fire. But 3 days before the anniversary date, I got a call from dispatch. There had been a last-minute change to my schedule. Another driver had called in sick and they needed me to pick up his load. The delivery? Automotive parts to a warehouse in Detroit. The same warehouse where I'd met Dennis exactly 1 year earlier. The same dock, the same receiving department, the same date on the delivery schedule. I considered refusing the load, calling in sick myself, anything to avoid what seemed like an inevitable fate. But I needed the work, and I couldn't explain to my dispatcher that I was avoiding a delivery because a man who spoke backwards had predicted a cargo fire. So I accepted the load, picked up the freight, and drove toward Detroit with a sense of approaching doom. The delivery was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, exactly the same time as my previous visit. I arrived early, just like before, and backed up to the same loading dock. Before going inside, I did a thorough inspection of my cargo, checking every box, looking for anything that might be flammable or dangerous. Everything appeared normal, just standard automotive parts and proper packaging. But Dennis had said something in the boxes would cause the fire, something I wouldn't notice until it was too late. I walked into the warehouse and headed for the receiving office. Through the window, I could see Dennis sitting at the same desk, looking exactly as he had a year earlier. I knocked and entered, and he looked up with that same patient smile. But this time when he spoke, his words were different. "Wollis diro woy," he said. "Hello, worried you." Then he paused and tilted his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. His expression changed, becoming confused, almost frightened. "Knorv signitamos, emitlin et ignaza, erif et ti, donsiti." Something is wrong. The timeline has changed. The fire, it is not. His reversed words were becoming fragmented, uncertain. For someone who claimed to see the future as his past, this confusion seemed deeply significant. He stood up from his desk, moving in those strange backward movements, and rushed to the window overlooking the dock where my truck was parked. I followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual. My truck sat there with its cargo doors open as the warehouse crew began unloading. Everything appeared normal, but Dennis was shaking his head, his reversed muttering becoming more agitated. Eric Ebdluosti, Erefet Wasiti, Tub 1, Gnition, Degnax sa Gnitamos. It should be here. The fire, I saw it, but now nothing. Something has changed. He turned to look at me, and there was wonder in his magnified eyes. Niwank at, he whispered. O Dloriwaya Suaka Dera Perperaway. Horoscal Tektek Tenerefit Gnitamos did Dene one. Buenas Yeret Enemilet, the knowing. Because I told you, you were prepared. You checked the cargo, did something different, and now there is a new timeline. He was suggesting that by warning me about the fire, by giving me knowledge of a future event, he had created a condition where I could change that future. My careful inspection of the cargo, my heightened awareness had somehow altered the timeline he'd witnessed. We stood there together watching as my cargo was completely unloaded without incident. No fire, no smoke, no emergency, just a normal delivery proceeding exactly as it should. Dennis processed my paperwork in silence, his movement still backward but his expression troubled. When he handed me the signed forms, his hand was shaking. Aerofeb site dias revenevi, he said quietly. Tabwoza tanawi wagnitamos. Never said this before, but I want to show you something. He led me deeper into the warehouse, past the rows of shelving and the machinery, to a back corner where old filing cabinets stood covered in dust. He opened one and pulled out a photograph, handing it to me. The photograph showed my truck engulfed in flames, smoke pouring from the trailer. The date stamp in the corner read exactly today's date, exactly the time we were standing there talking. But the fire in the photo had clearly already been put out. Emergency vehicles surrounding the scene. Could I sight, Dennis said. Ro ready are eket liwiti. Yadretse rofem huguatropoisti. Tau, erutufta tandidnepa? I took this. Or rather, I will take it. Yesterday for me, though for you it's... What? A future that didn't happen? The photograph was evidence of a timeline that had been prevented. A future that I had successfully avoided by being warned. Dennis put the photo back in the filing cabinet and closed the drawer. Emit, he said softly, si tonus dexiv seugnate, herutu fatignakuwai. Tenaos wenaot ni divom ebi wenimilit. Profims namesit cabni ogdinagnius nuserotsitat revendetarkeriu. Time is not as fixed as we think. You changed the future, and so we've moved into a new timeline. For me, this means going back and seeing new histories that were never created. He seemed troubled by this, as if the implications of a changed timeline were more significant for someone who experienced time backwards than for those of us who moved through it normally. Left the warehouse that day with my signed paperwork and a profound sense of having dodged something terrible. The cargo fire Dennis had predicted never happened, had been prevented by my awareness and preparation. But the experience left me with questions I couldn't answer. How many other futures had Dennis witnessed that never came to pass? How many timelines had branched and diverged based on the warnings he'd given to people who, like me, had somehow understood his reversed speech? I tried to return to that warehouse several times over the following year, hoping to talk to Dennis again, to understand more about his condition and his experience of time. But every time I went back, the receiving manager was someone else, someone normal who spoke in ordinary forward speech. When I asked about Dennis Kohler, they had no record of anyone by that name ever working there. The office where I'd met him twice had a different desk, different furniture, as if it had never been his space at all. I still have the memory of those conversations, still remember the sound of his reverse speech and the eerie way I understood every word, and I still wonder about the photograph he showed me, the evidence of a future that never occurred, a timeline that was overwritten by knowledge and preparation. Sometimes I think about all the moments in my life that could have gone differently, all the futures that might have branched away from the path I took, and I wonder if somewhere, somehow, there's someone like Dennis who witnessed all those other possibilities, all those other timelines, speaking about them in reverse as if they were memories instead of potential futures, The cargo fire never happened, but the memory of Dennis's warning and the knowledge that the future can be changed, that warnings from someone who sees time backwards can alter the course of events, that has stayed with me. I'm more careful now, more attentive to details that might seem insignificant, because I know that the future isn't fixed, that timelines can shift, and that sometimes the strangest encounters carry the most important messages, even if those messages come to you spoken backwards by a man who lives his life in reverse, moving from tomorrow to today to yesterday, seeing endings before beginnings and futures before pasts, trapped in a mirror image flow of time that the rest of us can barely comprehend. The shipment that aged overnight from iron. I've hauled every kind of cargo you can imagine over my 40 years on the road. Perishable goods, hazardous materials, livestock, heavy machinery, you name it. I've learned to handle temperature-sensitive freight, time-critical deliveries, and cargo that requires special permits and careful handling. But nothing in all those years prepared me for the shipment I picked up from a warehouse in Ohio. A load of consumer goods that somehow aged decades in the span of a single night. It started as a straightforward job. I was contracted to haul a full trailer load of electronics and household goods from a distribution center outside Columbus to retail stores across the Northeast. The manifest listed the usual stuff. Televisions, computers, kitchen appliances, all brand new merchandise still in manufacturer packaging. The load was sealed at the warehouse in standard procedure, and I signed off on it without giving it much thought. Just another delivery in another week of deliveries. The pickup went smoothly. The loading dock crew had my trailer packed and secured within 2 hours, and I was on the road by late afternoon. My route would take me through Pennsylvania, with stops at distribution centers in Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, and Philadelphia over the next 3 days. I'd done similar routes dozens of times before. It was good, steady work with reliable pay. I drove until about 9 that evening before pulling into a truck stop outside Youngstown for the night. I did my usual routine, grabbed dinner at the truck stop restaurant, took a shower, called my wife to check in, and settled into my sleeper berth for some rest. The parking lot was about half full, other trucks idling quietly around me, everything normal and routine. I fell asleep easily, tired from the day's drive. I woke around 6 in the morning to an odd smell. It was musty and stale, like the scent of old paper or a house that's been closed up for too long. I assumed it was coming from outside, maybe from the truck parked next to me or from the dumpsters near the building. I got dressed, climbed down from the cab, and walked around my truck to do my pre-drive inspection. That's when I noticed something strange about my trailer. The exterior, which had been clean and relatively new-looking when I picked it up the day before, now appeared weathered and aged. The paint was faded. There were rust spots along the lower panels, and the company decals were peeling and discolored like they'd been exposed to years of sun and weather. I stood there staring at it, confused, wondering if somehow I was looking at the wrong trailer. But the seal number matched my paperwork, and this was definitely the same unit I'd picked up in Columbus. I walked around the entire trailer, examining every side. The aging was consistent across all surfaces, not like damage from an accident or vandalism, but like natural deterioration from decades of use. The tires, which had been practically new, now showed significant wear. The rubber cracked and aged. The mud flaps were brittle and faded. Even the lights looked old, the plastic yellowed and cloudy. My first thought was that someone had switched my trailer during the night, that this was some kind of elaborate theft where someone had swapped my cargo for an old trailer full of worthless goods. But that didn't make sense either. The seal was intact, unbroken, showing no signs of tampering. And truck stop parking lots have security cameras. No one could have switched an entire trailer without being seen. I went inside to the truck stop office and asked if they'd had any incidents overnight, any suspicious activity in the parking lot. The clerk checked the security footage from the overnight hours and showed me the playback. My truck sat in the same spot all night. No vehicles approaching it, no people near it except me when I parked and when I walked to the building for dinner. The trailer hadn't been touched, but in the footage I could clearly see the trailer's appearance changing, slowly transforming from new to aged over the course of the night, like watching time-lapse photography of decay. The clerk and I watched in stunned silence as the trailer on the screen gradually weathered and deteriorated. The process was subtle, barely noticeable in real time, but when compressed into fast-forward playback, it was obvious and impossible. Paint fading, rust spreading, materials degrading, all happening while the trailer sat motionless in the parking lot. The clerk backed away from the monitor, making the sign of the cross, and refused to watch anymore. I went back to my truck and stood there trying to decide what to do. I called my dispatcher and tried to explain the situation, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He asked if I'd been drinking, if I was feeling all right, if maybe I needed to take some time off. I took pictures of the trailer with my phone and texted them to him, along with the pictures I'd taken when I picked up the load the day before. The difference was undeniable. The trailer had aged 30 or 40 years overnight. After a long silence, my dispatcher told me to break the seal and check the cargo. Company policy normally prohibited breaking seals except at delivery, but this was clearly an exceptional circumstance. I got my tools and cut through the seal, then opened the trailer doors. The musty smell that I'd noticed earlier came pouring out, stronger now, the scent of age and decay. Inside the trailer, the cargo had aged just like the trailer itself. The cardboard boxes were yellowed and brittle, covered in dust and showing signs of moisture damage and deterioration. The packing tape had dried out and was peeling away. The manufacturer labels were faded and barely legible. I pulled out a box marked as containing a new television and carefully opened it. Inside was a television, but not a new one. It was an old cathode ray tube model, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in decades, and it showed obvious signs of age and disuse. The plastic casing was yellowed, the screen was dusty, and when I tried the power button, nothing happened. I opened more boxes, finding the same thing in each one. Brand new electronics and appliances had somehow transformed into their obsolete counterparts from decades past. A laptop computer had become an old desktop with a floppy disk drive. A modern microwave had become a boxy unit from the 1970s. Kitchen appliances had transformed into vintage models, and none of them were in new condition. They all showed signs of age, as if they'd been sitting in someone's attic or basement for 30 or 40 years. I called my dispatcher back and described what I was seeing. He was silent for a long time, then told me to secure the trailer and wait while he contacted the warehouse and the clients. Over the next few hours, I sat in my truck while calls went back and forth between various parties. Representatives from the warehouse, from the retail chain that was supposed to receive the goods, and eventually from the insurance company, all wanted to see evidence of what I was claiming. By afternoon, an inspector arrived from the insurance company, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude. She examined the trailer, photographed the cargo, took samples of the packaging materials. She interviewed me extensively about the timeline, about what I'd seen and when. She reviewed the security footage from the truck stop, and through it all, her expression grew more troubled and confused. "I've been doing this job for 25 years, she finally said, and I've seen cargo damaged in every way imaginable. Fire, water, theft, contamination, you name it. But I've never seen anything like this. This isn't damage. This is impossible." She took more photographs, collected more samples, and told me that the company would conduct a full investigation. In the meantime, I was instructed to deliver the aged cargo to a secure facility where it could be examined more thoroughly. The facility was a warehouse on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, nondescript and unmarked. I backed up to the loading dock and waited while a team of people in what looked like hazmat suits unloaded my trailer. They treated the cargo with extreme caution, as if it might be contaminated with something dangerous. Each box was photographed, cataloged, and carefully removed. The process took hours. While I waited, one of the investigators came to talk to me. He was younger, maybe in his 30s, and he seemed more curious than alarmed. He asked me detailed questions about the shipment, about when I'd first noticed the changes, about whether I'd experienced any unusual phenomena during the drive or at the truck stop. I told him about the smell, about the security footage, about my shock at discovering the aged cargo. "Do you know what was in the original shipment?" he asked. "I mean specifically what brand and model of electronics." I checked my manifest and read off the details. He nodded slowly. "Those are all current models released within the last 6 months. But what's in your trailer now, those are models from the 1970s and 80s. Not reproductions or vintage stock, but actual units from that era, showing appropriate wear and aging." He explained that the team was working on several theories. One possibility was some kind of contamination, a chemical or biological agent that had accelerated the aging process of the materials. Another was that the cargo had somehow been exposed to extreme conditions, intense heat or radiation that had degraded everything rapidly. But none of those theories explained the security footage showing the transformation happening gradually overnight, or the fact that the electronics hadn't just aged but had actually transformed into their historical equivalents. "There's another theory," he said quietly, "one that most of the team won't say out loud. The possibility that your cargo somehow moved through time, that it was exposed to a temporal anomaly that displaced it by several decades, aging everything inside while the rest of the world moved forward normally." He looked at me carefully. "Have you ever experienced anything unusual on your runs before? Any lost time, any strange phenomena?" I told him about a few odd incidents over the years, things I'd mostly dismissed as coincidence or tricks of tired eyes. Times when my clock seemed to jump forward or backward, stretches of road I didn't remember driving, that sort of thing. He took notes on everything, nodding as if my experiences confirmed something he already suspected. The investigation continued for weeks. The cargo was examined by experts in materials science, electronics, chemistry, and several fields I'd never heard of. My trailer was scanned with various equipment, tested for radiation and chemical residue, photographed from every angle. I was interviewed multiple times, asked to recreate my exact route and timeline, even required to undergo a medical examination to make sure I hadn't been exposed to anything dangerous. The official conclusion, at least the one released to me and my company, was that the cargo had been damaged by an unknown process that accelerated aging and deterioration. The insurance paid out the claim, the clients received compensation, and I was cleared of any wrongdoing. But I knew there was more to it than that. The investigator who'd talked to me about temporal anomalies contacted me privately afterward and told me that the team had found evidence of what they called chronological displacement, though he couldn't or wouldn't explain what that meant in detail. What bothered me most was the question of where the original cargo had gone. If my trailer full of new electronics had somehow aged and transformed overnight, what had happened to the actual new merchandise? Had it simply ceased to exist, replaced by vintage equivalents from the past? Or had it been displaced somewhere else in time, appearing in someone else's trailer in some other era? I continued driving after the incident was resolved, though I was more cautious about the loads I accepted. I turned down several shipments from that same warehouse in Columbus, unwilling to risk another temporal anomaly or whatever it had been. And I paid more attention to my cargo during overnight stops, checking on it periodically, looking for any signs of change or deterioration. But I never experienced anything like that shipment again. My cargo stayed the same from pickup to delivery, aging normally or not at all depending on the contents. The trailer that had aged overnight was taken out of service and sent to a research facility, or at least that's what I was told. My company replaced it with a new unit, and I went back to running my regular routes. Still, the memory stayed with me. The smell of age and dust, the sight of new cargo transformed into vintage relics, the security footage showing impossible decay happening in real time. And sometimes when I'm alone on a dark highway in the middle of the night, I think about time and how we move through it. We assume it flows in one direction, that past is past and future is future. That cargo picked up today will be the same cargo delivered tomorrow. But I know now that time isn't always that simple, that somehow, under certain conditions, things can slip sideways through the years, aging in moments or perhaps even moving backward into history. I think about all the trucks on the road at any given moment, all the cargo being transported across the country, and I wonder how many of them might be experiencing their own temporal anomalies. How many drivers have opened their trailers to find cargo that's aged or transformed or disappeared entirely? How many of these incidents go unreported because they're too strange to explain, too impossible to believe? And how many times has someone's new television or computer or appliance arrived at their door already decades old, already bearing the marks of a past they never lived through? The answers to those questions exist somewhere, filed away in insurance claims and investigation reports and the private records of companies that don't want the public to know how fragile our normal reality really is. But I know the truth, or at least part of it. I know that time can slip and slide and age things overnight. That cargo can transform into its past self while sitting motionless in a parking lot, and that the boundary between now and then is thinner than we think. And every time I pick up a new load, I wonder if this will be the one that doesn't arrive in the same condition it left. The one that crosses some invisible line between present and past, between new and impossibly old. The cargo hold that smelled like graves from Ghost Gear Gary. They call me Ghost Gear Gary because I run the night shifts, the runs that nobody else wants, delivering loads after midnight to warehouses and distribution centers that operate 24 hours. I've gotten used to the darkness, the empty roads, the strange isolation that comes with being one of the few vehicles moving through the world while everyone else sleeps. But there's one load I'll never forget. One cargo that changed the way I think about what might be riding in the back of my trailer when I'm not looking. It was mid-November, cold and damp, when I got the call for a special pickup. The dispatcher said it was urgent, that the shipper had specifically requested a night run, and that the pay was double my normal rate. The cargo was listed as medical supplies and specimens destined for a research facility upstate, and the pickup location was a hospital in rural Pennsylvania. Medical runs weren't unusual, and I'd hauled everything from pharmaceuticals to lab equipment before, so I accepted the job without much thought. I arrived at the hospital around midnight. The building was mostly dark except for the emergency room entrance and a few scattered windows, showing lights from patient rooms. The loading dock was around back, accessed through a service road that wound behind the main building. The area was dimly lit and quiet, no one around except for a single person waiting by the dock door. The man was dressed in hospital scrubs and wore a surgical mask that covered most of his face. He didn't introduce himself or make small talk, just gestured for me to back up my empty trailer to the dock. When I'd positioned the truck correctly, he opened the dock door and disappeared inside. I waited in my cab, filling out paperwork, expecting to see a forklift or pallet jack emerge with cargo loaded onto standard shipping containers. Instead, the man wheeled out a series of long wooden crates on a dolly. The crates were simple pine construction, maybe 7 feet long and 2 feet wide, with metal handles on each end. They looked old, weathered, like something from a different era. There were 10 of them total, and he loaded them into my trailer himself, refusing my offer to help, stacking them carefully in 2 rows along the trailer walls. As he worked, I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something unpleasant, but as more crates were loaded, it grew stronger. It smelled like earth and decay, like dirt from a grave or a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. I mentioned it to the man, asking if the medical specimens were properly sealed, but he just shook his head and said, "They're secure. Just deliver them quickly." He gave me the paperwork, which listed the cargo as historical medical specimens, with a delivery address for a research facility about 200 miles away. The delivery window was narrow, just 3 hours to make the run, which was tight but doable if I drove straight through. He closed my trailer doors, secured them with a numbered seal, and waved me off without another word. I pulled out of the hospital and headed for the highway, trying to ignore the smell that was somehow seeping into my cab despite the trailer being sealed. It was that grave smell, damp and cold and wrong, and it grew stronger as I drove. I cracked my window, hoping fresh air would help, but the November night was cold and only made the cab uncomfortable. I closed the window and tried to focus on the road, tried to convince myself the smell was just my imagination. About an hour into the drive, I started hearing sounds from the trailer. At first they were subtle, barely audible over the engine and road noise. Soft thumping, like something shifting inside the crates. I told myself it was normal, that cargo often settles and moves during transport, especially on rougher stretches of highway. But the sounds continued and became more distinct. Scratching like fingernails on wood, a low creaking like someone moving inside a confined space. I turned up the radio trying to drown out the noises, but I could still hear them. The scratching was becoming more insistent, more rhythmic, like something was trying to get out. And under it all was a sound that might have been breathing, ragged and wet, the kind of breath that comes from damaged lungs or a throat full of fluid. I glanced at my mirrors, half expecting to see something crawling out of the trailer, but the doors remained closed, the seal intact. The smell was overwhelming now, filling the cab with that scent of earth and rot. I could taste it, thick and cloying, making my stomach turn. I pulled over at a rest area, needing to get out of the cab, needing fresh air and a moment to collect myself. The rest area was nearly empty. Just one other truck parked far away with its lights off, the driver presumably asleep. I walked around my trailer, checking the seal, making sure everything was secure. The sounds from inside had stopped when I pulled over, leaving an eerie silence. I pressed my ear against the trailer wall, listening. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard a voice. Muffled, distant, barely audible. It sounded like it was saying help or let me out, or maybe just groaning wordlessly. The sound made every hair on my body stand up. I backed away from the trailer and pulled out my phone to call the dispatcher. Before I could dial, the other truck in the rest area started its engine and pulled out, its driver looking at me as he passed. He had a strange expression, something between pity and fear, and he shook his head slowly as if warning me about something. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the rest area with my cargo of medical specimens that smelled like graves and made sounds like trapped people. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to explain what was happening. The smell, the sounds, the voice I'd heard. He was silent for a long moment, then told me that this was a special contract, that the shipper had insisted on discretion, and that I was expected to complete the delivery without questions or delays. When I pressed for more information about what exactly I was hauling, he told me I didn't want to know and that I should just drive straight to the delivery location and let them handle unloading. "Gary," he said quietly, "this isn't the first time we've hauled cargo from that hospital, and it won't be the last. The drivers who ask too many questions about it tend to refuse future jobs with us. The drivers who just complete the delivery and don't think too hard about it stay on our roster and get good pay. Which kind of driver do you want to be?" I understood what he was saying. Don't ask questions, don't investigate, just deliver the cargo and collect my money. It was a choice between curiosity and income, between knowing the truth and maintaining plausible deniability. I'd been driving long enough to know that sometimes the best thing you can do is put your head down and focus on the job. But standing there in that dark rest area with the smell of graves in my nostrils and the memory of that muffled voice in my ears, I wasn't sure I could do that. I got back in my truck and continued driving toward the delivery location. The sounds from the trailer resumed almost immediately, louder now, more frantic. The scratching became pounding, the breathing became gasping, and the voice, or voices plural now, became clearer. They were calling out, pleading, crying. I could hear words in languages I didn't recognize, mixed with English phrases that chilled me. Don't leave us. It's so cold. Please God, someone help us. I drove faster, desperate to reach the delivery location and be rid of this cargo. The research facility was in a remote area, accessible only by a long private road that wound through dark woods. As I turned onto that road, my headlights caught something that made my blood run cold. Crosses. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, lining both sides of the road. Simple wooden crosses like grave markers, each one unmarked but clearly meant as memorials. The facility itself was a squat concrete building with very few windows, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. Security lights illuminated the loading dock area, where several people in protective suits were waiting. I backed up my trailer and they immediately began the unloading process, working with practiced efficiency. They didn't speak to me, didn't make eye contact, just opened the trailer and began removing the crates. As each crate was removed, the sounds from inside became more distinct. I could hear them clearly now, the voices and the movement. One of the crates was dropped, hitting the dock floor hard, and I heard something inside scream. Not a muffled sound, but a clear human scream of pain and terror. The workers picked up the crate and carried it inside without acknowledging what we'd all heard. When the trailer was empty, one of the workers brought me paperwork to sign. Through the protective suit and face shield, I could see that he was young, maybe mid-20s, and there were tears running down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered as I signed the delivery confirmation. "I'm so sorry you had to hear them." "What are they?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. He looked toward the building where the crates had been taken, then back at me. "The past," he said quietly. "Medical history that should have been buried and forgotten, but instead gets studied and analyzed and transported in the middle of the night, because the law says we have to keep them. To preserve them as evidence or research materials or some bureaucratic justification that helps people sleep at night." He wouldn't elaborate further, just handed me my paperwork and told me to leave immediately and not to stop anywhere on the private road leading out. I climbed back into my cab, which still reeked of that grave smell despite the cargo being gone, and drove back down the road lined with crosses. In my mirrors, I could see the facility lights and the workers moving around, and I wondered what kind of research they were conducting with cargo that screamed and pleaded and smelled like death. Made it back to the main highway and drove for another hour before stopping at a truck stop to try to clean my trailer. I used every deodorizer and cleaner I could find, scrubbed every surface I could reach, but the smell lingered. It took weeks before it finally faded, and even now, 2 years later, I can sometimes catch a hint of it on cold, damp nights. I never asked the dispatcher for details about that hospital or that research facility. I never tried to find out what exactly I'd hauled that night. Part of me doesn't want to know, wants to maintain some distance between myself and the truth, but another part of me, the part that can't forget those voices calling out from inside the crates, knows that I was complicit in something dark. I transported human remains, or maybe something worse than remains, something that was somehow still aware and suffering, trapped in those wooden boxes like specimens in a museum. I still take night runs, still haul cargo after midnight when the world is dark and empty, but I'm more selective now about the jobs I accept. I ask more questions, push back when dispatchers are vague about cargo contents, and I refuse any pickup from that hospital in Pennsylvania. Other drivers have taken those runs, and a few of them have mentioned similar experiences to me in quiet conversations at truck stops. The smell, the sounds, the voices. But most of them, like me, don't push for answers. They complete their deliveries, collect their pay, and try not to think too hard about what they might have transported, because some cargo isn't meant to be understood. Some shipments carry history that's too dark, too painful, too morally complex to be examined in the light of day. They're transported at night by drivers who know better than to ask questions. delivered to facilities hidden away from public view, and stored in rooms that smell like graves because that's what they should have been in the first place. And those of us who haul these loads carry the weight of that knowledge, the burden of complicity, and the sound of voices that should have been silent long ago, but somehow still call out from inside wooden crates on cold November nights. The dispatch order, from a company that doesn't exist, from Diesel Dan. They've been in the trucking business long enough to know that paperwork is everything. Bills of lading, delivery receipts, dispatch orders, manifests. Every load you haul comes with a paper trail that proves where it came from, where it's going, and who's responsible for it. In 35 years of driving, I've handled thousands of these documents, and I've learned to spot irregularities pretty quickly. But the dispatch order I received on a rainy Tuesday in April was something else entirely. A document from a company that, according to every record I could find, has never existed at all. The order came through on my company's standard dispatch system, showing up on my electronic tablet the same way all my assignments did. The format was correct, the routing codes looked legitimate, and it appeared in my queue just like any other job. The pickup was scheduled for the following morning at a warehouse in Indianapolis, with delivery to a distribution center in Kansas City. The cargo was listed as industrial equipment, weight and dimensions all within normal parameters, and the pay was standard for that route and distance. What caught my attention was the client name, Meridian Industrial Solutions. I'd been hauling freight for dozens of companies over the years, and I prided myself on knowing most of the major players in the logistics industry, at least by name. But I'd never heard of Meridian Industrial Solutions. That wasn't necessarily unusual. Companies merge, rebrand, and new businesses start up all the time. But something about the name felt off, like it was too generic, too carefully constructed to sound legitimate without actually meaning anything. I did what I always did when I got an assignment from an unfamiliar company. I looked them up online. I searched for Meridian Industrial Solutions in every combination I could think of, checked business directories, looked for their website, searched for any news articles or press releases. Nothing came up. Not a single result. No website, no social media presence, no business registration, no reviews, no complaints. It was as if the company simply didn't exist outside of this one dispatch order on my tablet. I called my dispatcher to ask about the client. He pulled up the same order on his system and read me the same information I was seeing. When I asked if he knew anything about Meridian Industrial Solutions, he said he'd never heard of them either, but that the order had come through the proper channels with all the correct authorization codes. He checked with his supervisor, who checked with someone higher up, and they all confirmed that the order was legitimate and I should proceed with the pickup as scheduled. Sometimes we get new clients, my dispatcher said. Not every company has a big online presence. Maybe they're just starting out, or maybe they're a subsidiary of a larger corporation. The payment authorization checked out, so there's no reason not to take the job. He had a point. I was probably being paranoid, seeing problems where there weren't any. So I accepted the assignment and planned my route to Indianapolis. The pickup location was in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, the kind of area where dozens of warehouses and distribution centers clustered together in anonymous rows. The address led me to a building that looked recently constructed, clean concrete and metal siding, with a small sign near the entrance that read, Meridian Industrial Solutions, in simple black letters. So they did exist, at least physically. The building was here, the sign was real. I felt a bit foolish for my earlier concerns. I backed up to the loading dock and went inside to check in. The interior was surprisingly empty. There was a small office area near the entrance with a desk and a computer, but no one was sitting there. The warehouse space beyond was vast and dimly lit, with a few pallets of shrink-wrapped cargo sitting near the dock doors, but otherwise empty. No forklifts moving around, no workers visible, no sounds of activity. The place felt abandoned despite looking new. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. No response. I walked deeper into the warehouse, looking for someone who could authorize the loading. That's when I noticed that the pallets near the dock weren't labeled with any company information. No barcodes, no shipping labels, no identifying marks at all. Just plain shrink wrap covering boxes of uniform size and shape. A door opened at the far end of the warehouse and a man emerged. He was middle-aged, wearing casual business attire and carrying a clipboard. He walked toward me with a slight smile, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. "You must be Dan," he said, extending his hand. "Right on time. We have your cargo ready to load." I shook his hand and asked for his name, but he just gestured toward the pallets. "Everything's staged and ready. 4 pallets, each weighing approximately 800 pounds. Should fit nicely in your trailer." He handed me a bill of lading that had all the correct information. My name, my company, the destination in Kansas City, the cargo description. Everything looked legitimate except for one thing. Where the shipper's signature should have been, there was just a printed name with no actual signature. And the name printed there was simply Authorized Agent. "I need a proper signature," I told him. "Company policy requires a real signature from the shipper." The man looked at me for a moment, then took the clipboard back and signed it with a pen. The signature was illegible, just a quick scrawl that could have been anything. But it was a signature, and that would technically satisfy the requirement. He handed the clipboard back and gestured for me to open my trailer. The loading process was strange. The man worked alone, using a pallet jack to move the cargo from the warehouse to my trailer. He refused my offer to help, insisting he had it under control. The pallets were heavy and he struggled with them, but he was determined to do it himself. As he loaded the last pallet, I noticed something odd about the shrink wrap. There were small tears in a few places, and through the tears I could see the boxes underneath. They were plain brown cardboard with no markings, no labels, nothing to indicate what was inside. "What exactly is in these boxes?" I asked. The man looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Industrial equipment," he said, echoing the description from the dispatch order. "Replacement parts for manufacturing machinery. Nothing hazardous, nothing perishable, just standard industrial goods." His answer was technically sufficient, but it felt evasive, like he was telling me what I needed to hear rather than the actual truth. He closed my trailer doors and attached a seal, then handed me the final paperwork. "Drive safely," he said. "The consignee in Kansas City is expecting this delivery tomorrow afternoon. Don't be late." He turned and walked back into the warehouse before I could ask any more questions, disappearing through the same door he'd emerged from. I stood there for a moment, looking at the sealed trailer and the paperwork in my hand, feeling increasingly uneasy about this load. I got back on the road and headed west toward Kansas City. The drive should have taken about 8 hours with stops, an easy overnight run. But about 2 hours into the trip, while I was cruising through Illinois on Interstate 70, I started noticing vehicles following me. It began with a black SUV that appeared in my mirrors and maintained a consistent distance behind me, never passing, never falling back. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I slowed down, it slowed down. I thought I might be imagining things, so I took an exit to test whether the SUV was actually following me, or just happened to be going the same direction. The SUV took the same exit. I pulled into a gas station, and the SUV pulled into the lot behind me but didn't stop at a pump. It just parked near the edge of the lot with its engine running, the windows too darkly tinted to see who was inside. I went inside the gas station and bought a coffee, taking my time, watching through the windows. The SUV remained in place, not moving, just sitting there like it was waiting for me. When I came back out and climbed into my truck, the SUV's headlights came on. I pulled back onto the highway and the SUV followed, resuming its position about 100 yards behind me. Over the next few hours, the SUV was joined by other vehicles. A gray sedan, a white panel van, even a motorcycle. They all followed the same pattern, maintaining distance but never losing sight of me, changing positions occasionally but always keeping me under observation. It was like I was in the center of a mobile surveillance operation, surrounded by watchers who were making no effort to be subtle about their presence. I tried calling my dispatcher to report what was happening, but my phone wouldn't connect. No signal, even though I was traveling through areas where I normally had full coverage. My CB radio was similarly useless, just static on every channel. I was being followed by multiple vehicles and had no way to communicate with anyone. The situation was quickly moving from unsettling to frightening. When I crossed into Missouri, the vehicles following me all suddenly pulled off at the same exit, as if they'd received a coordinated signal. One moment I had 5 or 6 vehicles in my vicinity. The next I was alone on the highway with no other traffic visible in either direction. The sudden absence was almost as disturbing as their presence had been. I drove in tense silence for another hour, constantly checking my mirrors, expecting them to reappear. As I approached Kansas City, my phone suddenly had signal again. I immediately called my dispatcher and told him about the surveillance, about the vehicles that had been following me. He listened to my story and then checked the delivery address. There was a long pause before he spoke again. Dan, are you sure about this address? Because I'm looking at it on the map, and it's showing up as an empty lot. I pulled over and checked the address myself on my GPS. He was right. The coordinates listed on the dispatch order led to a vacant lot in an industrial area of Kansas City, not to any actual building or business. I looked at the paperwork again, at the name Meridian Industrial Solutions, and the unauthorized agent's illegible signature, and I realized I'd been set up for something. But what? What was I carrying, and who wanted it delivered to an empty lot? I was about 20 minutes from the delivery location. I could continue forward and see what happened, or I could refuse to deliver and deal with the consequences. My dispatcher advised me to at least drive by the location to see if there was something at the address that wasn't showing up on GPS, some building that hadn't been mapped yet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The delivery location was in a desolate part of the city, surrounded by abandoned warehouses and overgrown lots. The address led to exactly what my GPS had shown. An empty lot, just cracked concrete and weeds with no structure of any kind. But there were people waiting there. A group of maybe 10 individuals, all wearing dark clothing, standing around several vehicles with their engines running. As I pulled up, they immediately moved toward my truck. One of them approached my driver's window and gestured for me to roll it down. I cracked it a few inches, keeping my hand near my CB radio's emergency button. "You have our delivery," he said. Not a question, a statement. "We need you to open the trailer so we can unload." "I need to see identification," I said. "I need proof that you're the authorized consignee." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We're the ones who ordered the shipment. We're Meridian Industrial Solutions. Now open the trailer." "Meridian Industrial Solutions doesn't exist," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I checked. There's no business registration, no corporate records, nothing. And this delivery address is an empty lot. So I'm not opening this trailer until I get some real answers about who you are and what I'm actually carrying." The man's smile faded. He stepped back and made a gesture to the others, who began moving closer to my truck. I quickly made a decision. I put the truck in gear and drove away from that lot as fast as my loaded rig could move, leaving the group of people standing there watching me leave. In my mirror, I saw them scrambling for their vehicles, clearly intending to follow. I called 911 as I drove, telling the operator that I was a commercial driver who'd been given fraudulent delivery instructions and was now being pursued by unknown individuals. She stayed on the line with me while I drove toward the nearest highway patrol station, which was about 15 minutes away. The vehicles from the lot caught up with me and fell into the same surveillance pattern as before. following but not attempting to stop me or force me off the road. When I pulled into the highway patrol station with my convoy of followers, they immediately dispersed, the vehicles scattering in different directions before the troopers could even react. I explained the situation to the officers, showed them my dispatch order and the bill of lading, told them about the company that didn't exist and the empty lot delivery location. The troopers called in additional support and escorted me to a secure facility where the trailer could be safely opened and examined. When they broke the seal and opened the doors, what they found wasn't industrial equipment at all. The boxes contained firearms, hundreds of them, military-grade weapons that had been reported stolen from a military transport 6 months earlier. I'd been hauling stolen weapons, set up as an unwitting mule in what appeared to be an illegal arms trafficking operation. The investigation that followed lasted for months. Federal agents interviewed me repeatedly, examining every detail of the pickup, the fake dispatch order, the surveillance vehicles, the attempted delivery. They traced the dispatch order back through my company's systems and found that it had been inserted directly into the database by someone with sophisticated hacking skills. The warehouse in Indianapolis where I'd picked up the cargo was found abandoned, completely empty, with no trace of the man who'd loaded my trailer. Even the sign reading Meridian Industrial Solutions was gone. The people who'd been waiting at the empty lot were never identified or caught. The vehicles that had followed me were all registered to shell companies or had been reported stolen. Every lead the investigators followed dead-ended in layers of false identities and untraceable communications. Whoever had orchestrated this operation had covered their tracks thoroughly. I was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, classified as an unwitting participant in the scheme. But the experience changed how I approached every dispatch order after that. I became more careful, more skeptical, more willing to ask questions and push back when something didn't feel right, and I learned that in the world of logistics and freight hauling, not everything is what it seems. Sometimes the cargo you're carrying isn't what the paperwork says. Sometimes the companies you think you're working for don't actually exist. And sometimes the only thing protecting you from becoming a criminal accomplice is your own willingness to question orders and refuse deliveries that don't make sense. I still drive, still haul loads across the country, still depend on dispatch orders to tell me where to go and what to pick up. But I verify everything now. I check company registrations. I confirm delivery addresses. I ask for identification from anyone who wants to load cargo into my trailer, because I know that somewhere out there, someone is still running operations like the one I stumbled into, using legitimate trucking companies and unsuspecting drivers to move illegal goods across the country. And the next dispatch order from a company that doesn't exist might not be caught before it's too late. The rest stop with only trucks. No drivers from Lonely Larry. They call me Lonely Larry not because I'm antisocial, but because I prefer solo runs. The kind where you drive for days without much human contact. Just you and the road and your thoughts. I've always found peace in that solitude, in the rhythm of miles passing and the freedom of being alone with the highway stretching endlessly ahead. But there's one night that made me understand why humans need each other. Why isolation can become something darker than peaceful. Why a rest stop full of trucks with no drivers is more terrifying than being completely alone. It was late September, and I was running a load from Memphis to Seattle, a cross-country haul that would take me 4 days of steady driving. I'd made it through Tennessee and Arkansas without incident, spent a night in Oklahoma, and was deep into Kansas when I started feeling the fatigue that comes from too many hours behind the wheel. It was around 3 in the morning, that dead hour when even the most dedicated night drivers start to feel their concentration slipping, and I knew I needed to stop and rest. The rest area appeared on the horizon like a blessing, its lights cutting through the prairie darkness. The sign announced it as the Prospect Hill Rest Area, a name I didn't recognize despite having driven this route several times before. but rest areas sometimes get renamed or rebuilt, so I didn't think much of it. I just needed a safe place to park for a few hours and recharge before continuing west. As I pulled off the highway and onto the access road, I noticed there were a lot of trucks already parked there. The lot was nearly full. Rigs lined up in neat rows, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber against the night sky. Good, I thought. A busy rest stop meant other drivers around. And while I preferred solitude while driving, there was something comforting about being near other people when you stop for the night. I found an open space near the back of the lot and backed my trailer in carefully, positioning myself between a Freightliner on my left and a Peterbilt on my right. Both trucks had their running lights on, but no other signs of activity. No idling engines, no movement in the cabs, no lights visible in the sleeper berths. They were just sitting there dark and silent, like they'd been parked and abandoned. I climbed down from my cab and stretched, working out the stiffness from hours of sitting. The rest area was quiet, unnaturally so. Despite the full parking lot, there was no sound except for a distant highway hum and the occasional gust of wind across the prairie. No truck engines, no generators running, no voices or CB radio chatter. Just silence and stillness and those rows of parked trucks like sleeping giants. I walked toward the rest area building, a typical single-story structure with restrooms and vending machines. The lights were on inside, fluorescent brightness spilling out through the windows, but as I got closer, I realized I couldn't see anyone inside. The building appeared to be completely empty. I pushed open the door and the motion sensor chimed, announcing my arrival to no one. The restrooms were clean and functional, nothing unusual about them. The vending machines hummed quietly, their displays showing the usual selection of snacks and drinks. There were a few picnic tables and a bulletin board with faded notices about highway safety and local attractions. Everything was normal except for the complete absence of people. In a rest area this busy, there should have been at least a few drivers using the facilities or grabbing snacks, but I was alone. I used the restroom and bought a bottle of water from one of the vending machines, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty building. Through the windows, I could see all those trucks in the parking lot, their running lights still on, still silent and motionless. I counted them quickly. 37 trucks. 37 drivers who should have been somewhere, in the building or in their cabs or walking around the grounds. But there was no one. I walked back outside and made my way through the parking lot, looking more carefully at each truck as I passed. They were all legitimate commercial vehicles, different makes and models, different company logos, different license plates from states across the country. Nothing unusual about any of them except that they all appeared to be completely empty. No drivers visible through the windows, no signs of life in any of the sleeper berths, no personal items or belongings visible on the dashboards or seats. I knocked on a few cab doors, calling out to see if anyone was inside sleeping. No responses. I tried door handles and found them all locked. I looked underneath trailers, thinking maybe drivers were doing inspections or repairs, but found nothing. I walked the entire perimeter of the parking lot, checking every truck systematically, and confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. All 37 trucks were empty. Wherever their drivers had gone, they'd left their rigs behind with lights on and doors locked. The rational part of my brain suggested explanations. Maybe there'd been some kind of emergency that required all the drivers to evacuate. Maybe there was a tour bus or van that had picked everyone up for some reason. Maybe there was a diner or truck stop nearby that wasn't visible from the rest area, and all the drivers had walked there for food and coffee. But none of those explanations felt right. There were no signs of emergency, no notices posted, and I'd driven past this area recently enough to know there weren't any services within walking distance. I went back to my truck and tried my CB radio, calling out on the standard channel to see if anyone was monitoring. This is Lonely Larry at Prospect Hill Rest Area, looking for any drivers in the vicinity. Anyone out there? Static answered me, consistent and unchanging. I tried other channels with the same result. My cell phone showed no signal, even though I'd had full bars when I pulled off the highway. I sat in my cab with the doors locked, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct was telling me to start my engine and leave immediately, to get back on the highway and put distance between myself and this too quiet rest area full of abandoned trucks. But I was exhausted, barely functional after the long drive, and the idea of getting back behind the wheel in my current state was dangerous. I'd be a hazard to myself and anyone else on the road, so I compromised. I would rest here for 2 hours, just enough to take the edge off my fatigue, and then I would leave whether I felt fully rested or not. I set an alarm on my phone, made sure all my doors were locked, and reclined my seat. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every sound made me tense. The wind against my truck, the creak of the trailer settling, the distant highway noise, all of it seemed amplified and threatening in the darkness. I must have dozed off despite my anxiety, because I woke suddenly to a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, multiple people walking through the parking lot, their feet crunching on gravel, their movements coordinated and purposeful. I sat up carefully and looked out my window, trying to see who was out there without drawing attention to myself. There were figures moving between the trucks, maybe 20 or 30 of them, walking in single file through the rows of parked vehicles. They moved in complete silence except for their footsteps, no talking, no calling out to each other, just this quiet procession through the lot. In the dim light from the truck's running lights, I couldn't make out any details about them. They were just dark shapes, human-sized and human-shaped, but moving with an odd stiffness that made them seem not quite right. The procession passed within a few feet of my truck, close enough that I could have reached out and touched them if my window had been open. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still, watching as they filed past. There was something wrong with the way they walked, something mechanical and inhuman about their gait. They moved like puppets or mannequins, their joints articulating at slightly wrong angles, their steps too uniform and synchronized. They continued through the parking lot and toward the rest area building, then disappeared around the far side of the structure. I waited for several minutes, expecting them to reappear, but they didn't come back. The parking lot was once again empty and silent, just rows of trucks with no drivers and no explanation for what I'd just witnessed. My alarm went off, the sound nearly making me scream in the quiet cab. I silenced it quickly and checked the time. 2 hours had passed, though it felt like I'd only been asleep for minutes. I started my engine immediately, no longer caring about rest or fatigue or anything except getting away from this place. As my truck rumbled to life, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The other trucks were starting their engines too, all of them simultaneously, as if my action had triggered some kind of chain reaction. 37 trucks all roaring to life at exactly the same moment, their lights brightening, their exhausts releasing clouds of diesel vapor into the cool night air. But through the windows, I could see that the cabs were still empty. The trucks were running themselves, starting without drivers, idling without anyone behind their wheels. I put my truck in gear and drove toward the exit as fast as I dared, weaving between the parked vehicles. In my mirrors, I could see the other trucks beginning to move as well. They were backing out of their spaces, turning, positioning themselves to follow me. An entire fleet of driverless trucks all moving in coordinated fashion, all heading toward the same exit I was using. I reached the access road and accelerated hard, my trailer swaying slightly as I pushed the speed higher than was safe for the turn. The driverless trucks followed, forming a convoy behind me, their headlights creating a wall of brightness in my mirrors. They maintained perfect spacing, perfect formation, like a military convoy being controlled by some central intelligence. When I merged back onto the highway, they followed. For the next 30 miles, I had a convoy of 37 empty trucks following me through the Kansas night, matching my speed, staying in formation, their running lights creating a mobile constellation that moved as one unit. Other drivers on the highway saw us and gave us wide berth, probably assuming it was some kind of organized transport operation. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn, the trucks behind me all took the same exit simultaneously, peeling off the highway in perfect synchronization. I watched in my mirrors as they disappeared down the exit ramp, and within moments the highway behind me was clear. They were gone as suddenly as they'd appeared, leaving me alone on the road with dawn breaking and my hands shaking on the wheel. I drove straight through to the next major truck stop, nearly 200 miles without stopping, running on pure adrenaline and fear. When I finally pulled into the lot and climbed down from my cab, my legs barely held me up. I went inside and bought coffee and sat in the diner for hours, surrounded by other drivers, grateful for human voices and normal conversation, and the mundane reality of a busy truck stop. I tried to find information about Prospect Hill Rest Area later, searching online and asking other drivers who regularly ran that route. No one had heard of it. The Kansas Department of Transportation had no rest area by that name on their maps. The location where I'd stopped showed only empty prairie land on satellite images, with no structures or parking lots visible. It was as if the rest area didn't exist or existed only sometimes, appearing for drivers who needed to stop and then disappearing again after they left. I've heard similar stories from other drivers since then. Rest areas that appear where they shouldn't be, parking lots full of trucks with no drivers, strange figures walking through the darkness between rows of silent vehicles. Most drivers who experience these things don't talk about them publicly, afraid of being dismissed as crazy or unreliable. But in quiet conversations at truck stops, in late-night CB radio calls on empty stretches of highway, the stories circulate and persist. I still make solo runs, still drive those long, lonely routes across the country, but I'm more careful now about where I stop to rest. I check maps before pulling off the highway, verify that rest areas are listed in official directories, and if I arrive at a stop and find it full of trucks with no drivers visible, I keep driving. Because I know that some places exist between reality and something else, and that the trucks parked in those places aren't waiting for their drivers to return. They're waiting for new drivers to arrive, waiting to add to their convoy, waiting to recruit more vehicles into their endless nocturnal procession through the nowhere lands between here and there. And I know that the line between being a driver and being driven, between controlling your truck and being controlled by it, can be crossed at rest areas that appear out of the darkness and vanish with the dawn. So I stay alert, I stay cautious, and I make very sure that when I park my truck and close my eyes to rest, I do it at places where other humans are visible and present, where voices and movement confirm that I'm still in the normal world, still among the living and the real, and not yet part of that silent fleet that travels highways only the lost and the desperate ever see. The delivery to the middle of the woods, from Rusty Joe after 30 years of hauling freight across North America. I thought I delivered to every type of location imaginable. Urban warehouses, rural farms, construction sites, military bases, offshore oil platforms accessed by causeway. But nothing in my experience prepared me for the delivery order that sent me deep into the forests of northern Maine, to coordinates that led not to any building or facility but to a clearing in the woods, where something was waiting, that defied every assumption I had about what constitutes a normal delivery. The dispatch came through in mid-October, peak fall color season in New England. The pickup was standard, a pallet of electronic equipment from a distributor in Boston, sealed and shrink-wrapped with all the proper paperwork. The delivery location was listed simply as GPS coordinates with a notation that read, "Remote installation site, no street address available." That wasn't entirely unusual. I'd made deliveries to construction sites and temporary facilities before using GPS coordinates. What was unusual was that when I plotted the coordinates, they fell in the middle of Baxter State Park, in a region where no roads appeared on any map I checked. I called my dispatcher to verify, thinking there must be an error. He confirmed the coordinates were correct and that the client had specifically requested delivery to that exact location. They'd prepaid for the shipment, including a substantial surcharge for the remote delivery, and they'd assured the company that there would be a passable route for a truck. It's probably some kind of research station or ranger facility, my dispatcher said. Parks have all kinds of installations that aren't marked on public maps. Just follow the coordinates and you'll find it. His explanation made sense, so I accepted the job and headed north from Boston. The drive through Massachusetts and New Hampshire was beautiful. The forests ablaze with autumn colors, the air crisp and clean. I crossed into Maine in the early evening and continued north on progressively smaller roads, following my GPS toward the coordinates. By the time I reached the town of Millinocket, the gateway to Baxter State Park, it was fully dark and I was the only vehicle on the road. The GPS directed me onto a logging road that branched off from the main park road. The surface was rough but passable, graded gravel with deep ruts from heavy equipment. My truck bounced and swayed as I drove deeper into the forest, the trees closing in on both sides until the road was just a narrow corridor through the darkness. My headlights caught glimpses of dense undergrowth, massive tree trunks, and occasionally the glowing eyes of animals watching from the shadows. After about an hour of slow progress on the logging road, my GPS indicated I was approaching the delivery coordinates. The road ahead ended in a clearing, a roughly circular space maybe 100 feet in diameter where the trees had been cut back. I pulled into the clearing and stopped, my headlights illuminating the far edge where the forest continued. There was no building, no facility, no structure of any kind. Just a clearing in the woods with what appeared to be a large stone marker or monument at its center. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the center of the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stone marker was actually a circle of standing stones about 20 feet in diameter, arranged in a perfect ring. Each stone was roughly 6 feet tall and appeared very old, covered in moss and lichen. In the center of the circle was a flat area of bare earth, compacted and smooth like it had been deliberately cleared and maintained. I stood there trying to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't a ranger station or research facility. This was something else, something that looked more like an archaeological site or perhaps some kind of monument. But why would anyone order electronic equipment delivered to a circle of stones in the middle of the forest? As I was puzzling over this, I heard a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was singing, or something like singing coming from the forest around me. Multiple voices in harmony, chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the sound rising and falling in rhythmic waves. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the trees, surrounding the clearing completely. Figures began emerging from the forest, appearing between the trees at the edge of the clearing. They were dressed in dark robes or cloaks, their faces hidden by deep hoods, moving in a slow processional walk toward the stone circle. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, forming a ring around the clearing's perimeter. They continued their chanting as they walked, the sound growing louder and more intense. I backed toward my truck, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. But before I could pull it out, one of the figures broke from the procession and approached me directly. The figure pushed back its hood, revealing the face of a woman, maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed completely at odds with the strange ceremony I was witnessing. "You must be Joe," she said in a normal speaking voice, as if we were meeting in a grocery store parking lot rather than a stone circle in the woods surrounded by chanting cultists. "Thank you for bringing our equipment. We were afraid you might not be able to find the location." She gestured toward my truck. "If you could place the pallet in the center of the circle, we'll handle it from there." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "What is this place? What are you people doing out here?" She smiled again, that same gentle smile. "We're a religious community. This is our sacred site, our place of gathering and worship. The equipment you've brought contains servers and networking gear for our communication system. We're trying to establish a connection point here. A connection point to what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She looked at the stone circle, then back at me. To others like us, around the world. We're part of a larger network, a community of believers who maintain these sites and keep the channels open. She must have seen the confusion on my face because she added, I know it seems strange. Most people don't understand what we do. But I promise we're harmless. We just need the equipment you've brought. And then you can go. The chanting had stopped, and all the robed figures were now standing silently around the perimeter, watching, waiting. I had a choice to make. I could refuse to unload, could get back in my truck and leave. Probably face consequences from my company for not completing the delivery. Or I could do what they were asking, place the pallet in the stone circle, get my delivery signature, and leave these people to their strange ritual. I chose the practical option. I'd come all this way, and the woman seemed sincere if unusual in her request. I returned to my truck, opened the trailer, and used my pallet jack to wheel the cargo to the center of the stone circle. As I positioned it on the bare earth, I noticed that the ground there was unusually warm, almost hot, as if heated from below. The woman followed me and examined the pallet, checking the seal and the packaging. Perfect, she said. Everything intact. Thank you. She pulled out a tablet, the modern technology looking surreal in her hands given her archaic robes, and had me sign the delivery confirmation electronically. As I signed, I noticed the recipient name on the form, the Threshold Collective. Another generic name, another organization I'd never heard of. But unlike Meridian Industrial Solutions from my earlier experience, these people were very real and standing right in front of me. Can I ask what you're going to do with this equipment? I said, my curiosity overcoming my caution. She considered the question for a moment, then gestured for me to follow her to the edge of the stone circle. From there, she pointed down at the ground. Look carefully at the earth between the stones. I directed my flashlight where she indicated and saw lines carved or burned into the ground, forming intricate patterns that connected each of the standing stones. The patterns were geometric but also organic, like circuit diagrams crossed with root systems. They glowed faintly, a bioluminescent shimmer that my eyes had initially dismissed as reflected light, but which I now realized was emanating from the lines themselves. These are connection points, she explained. They've existed for thousands of years, created by people who understood things we're only now beginning to rediscover. The lines you see connect this site to others around the world, creating a network, but the old connections are fading, becoming weak. We're trying to augment them with technology to create hybrid systems that combine the ancient pathways with modern communications infrastructure. She was describing something that sounded like pseudoscientific mysticism, the kind of thing I'd normally dismiss as nonsense. But standing there in that clearing, looking at lines that genuinely seemed to glow in the earth, surrounded by dozens of people who'd appeared silently from the forest, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. What happens when you connect these sites? I asked. She smiled, but this time there was something sad in her expression. We communicate. We share information and energy. We keep the network alive so that when it's needed, when the proper time comes, the channels will be open and ready. She turned to face me directly. You've seen strange things in your travels, haven't you, Joe? Things you couldn't explain? Places that shouldn't exist, events that defied normal logic? I nodded slowly, thinking of the gas station with frozen fuel, the highway signs that knew my name, the rest stop full of driverless trucks. All the impossible things I'd encountered over the years. How did you know? She gestured broadly at the forest around us. Because you're one of the ones who can see. Not everyone can. Most people drive past these places, past these moments, and they never notice. They never see the cracks in normal reality. But you do. That's why you were able to find this place. Why you were able to make this delivery. People who can't see would never have made it past the logging road. They would have gotten lost or turned back or convinced themselves they were going the wrong way. The robed figures around the clearing's edge began chanting again, a different pattern now, deeper and more resonant. The woman turned away from me and rejoined the group. "You should go now," she said over her shoulder. "Before the ceremony progresses further, what happens next isn't meant for outside observers." She pulled her hood back up and her face disappeared into shadow. I didn't need to be told twice. I returned to my truck, climbed into the cab, and started the engine. As I backed out of the clearing and turned back toward the logging road, I glanced in my mirrors one last time. The robed figures had formed a circle around the stone ring, and the pallet I'd delivered was glowing. The same bioluminescent shimmer as the lines in the earth, but much brighter. And in the center of the circle, something was beginning to materialize. Something tall and angular that seemed to be constructed from light and shadow woven together. I drove back down the logging road faster than was probably safe, the truck bouncing and swaying over the rough surface. I didn't slow down until I reached the main park road, and I didn't stop until I was completely out of Baxter State Park and back in areas with cell phone coverage and other vehicles on the road. I called my dispatcher and confirmed the delivery was complete, giving him the basics of the location without mentioning stone circles or robed figures or mysterious ceremonies. The money for the delivery cleared my account the next day, including a generous tip that I hadn't expected. There was a note attached to the payment. "Thank you for your service to the network. Your discretion is appreciated." It was signed with a symbol I didn't recognize, 3 interconnected circles with lines radiating from each one. I've made other deliveries since then, thousands of them to every type of location across North America. But I've never received another order from the Threshold Collective, and I've never returned to those coordinates in northern Maine. Sometimes I wonder what they're doing with the equipment I delivered, whether they successfully created their hybrid network, combining ancient stone circles with modern technology. And sometimes when I'm driving through remote areas late at night, I look for glowing lines in the earth or stone circles in the forests, wondering how many of these sites exist and how many of them are still active. Because the woman was right. I am one of the people who can see, who notices the cracks in normal reality and the places where impossibility leaks through. And that ability, that unwanted gift, has shown me that the world is far stranger than most people realize. That there are networks and connections and systems operating just below the surface of ordinary life. And sometimes when you're a long-haul trucker making deliveries to every corner of the country, you stumble across those systems and become, however briefly, a part of something much larger and much older than any shipping company or logistics network. You become a courier not just for goods and cargo, but for mysteries that were ancient before highways existed, before trucks were invented, before anyone thought to map the roads that would one day carry people like me into the deep woods where stone circles wait and strangers in robes tend to glowing lines that connect impossible things across impossible distances.